Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to be discussing a pretty big topic that's been kind of hidden for a very long time. Hidden on purpose, I would have to say. But before we begin, I need to make a few disclosures. I personally met or corresponded with several of the individuals discussed in this episode today. I first contacted Dr. Robert Hare in the mid 1990s, shortly after his book Without Conscience was released. We exchanged a few emails around 1994. At that time, I was dealing with a difficult situation involving Intel, where I'd previously worked. I was considering legal action, and that experience and how it unfolded opened my eyes to how systems of power actually operate. But there's another point of connection. Dr. Carl Gacono, he wrote the foreword to my book. I hadn't heard from Dr. Gacono in a number of years, but in 2020, Carl sent me an email that simply said, Bob is not a psychopath. I don't know where that was coming from, but I had shared with Carl over the years my feelings about Bob Hare being a psychopath myself from my own observations. So I was kind of surprised by this email. That's all it said. So I went and took a look. And it seemed like, and I'm speculating on this part, I do not have firsthand knowledge. It appears like Bob is retired and Carl was stepping in to continue to share their work together. But I don't have any confirmation about that. It's written on Robert Hare's website, so I'm making that assumption. And then Dr. Gacono later reached out to me in the last year or so about including my material in a new project. And once more, in connection with his book on female psychopaths. I did not respond to Dr. Gacono and I did not request to be put into his book. I can see that I've been added to his book, but I don't know on what level. That's all I know about that. And I also attended one of the early conferences in Florida where I met Robert Hare in person. Today's story is going to start about how a quiet medical idea from the 1940s, born in hospital wards and army bases, grew into a global system of checklists, risk scores, and behavior control. And how somewhere along the way, NATO, yes, the military alliance, ended up right in the middle of today's story. Who could have guessed, right? Good morning, NATO. All this scientific talk about dangerous personalities sat in a network of defense contractors, intelligence programs, and psychologists trying to measure something as fragile as conscience. And I was looking at another timeline I put together, and what got me started was I realized that when I looked at the overall timeline, there's two people that start all this. Hervey Cleckley was a famous psychiatrist from the 40s, and he wrote the book Mask of Sanity. Cleckley is considered the OG of psychopath research. And then along came Robert Hare, and for all these years, Robert Hare has stated that he got his idea after attending a NATO conference. So, yes, NATO is in this picture, but when I was looking through another timeline between Cleckley and Hare, something stuck out. I thought that Cleckley passed along his work to Hare, like thinking maybe after Cleckley was dead, Hare took over. But no, that's not how it worked out. Cleckley was still alive and well when Robert Hare entered the picture. So it got even more interesting, right? So Cleckley first gave the psychiatrist the mask about the psychopaths. Robert Hare turned it into a checklist. And later, these two researchers, who I'll be talking about, Scheme and Cook, they tried to question the whole thing and it all kind of blew up in the sky. And now we have Dr. Gacono, and he seems to be adding the ink blot to the test. And I'll get more into that later. So today we're going to follow that trail from the asylums of Georgia to NATO's research projects, and finally to the academic backlash that followed to ask a bigger question. When science starts working for power, Who gets to decide what sane means? For almost a century, psychiatry has claimed to know what a psychopath is. But behind that confidence lies a maze of ambition, secrecy, and control. From military hospitals in the 1940s to courtroom assessments and corporate boardrooms, this idea of the psychopath has shaped how we define danger and who we choose to fear. The word itself entered medicine in the shadow of World War II. It started with a Georgia psychiatrist named Hervey Cleckley, whose 1941 book, The Mask of Sanity, tried to explain how someone could look perfectly normal yet lack any sense of conscience. From Cleckley's studies of soldiers and veterans, the idea spread through Cold War labs, NATO research units, and finally into the legal system and popular culture. But what began as a medical curiosity turned into one of the most powerful and misused labels in modern psychology. Every generation invents its own version of evil. In the mid 20th century, a psychiatrist called it psychopathy, a diagnosis that promised to explain the people who hurt others without remorse. But behind the scene were deeper agendas: the military, intelligence agencies, and a new class of researchers building careers and systems around this mask of sanity. I wanted to find out where the story really began, not in textbooks or courtroom manuals, but in the institutions that built the modern mind. Who decided what psychopathy would mean? And why did their version become the one that stuck? To answer that, I went back to the start, to Cleckley's hospital wards, to the post war psychiatric networks that shaped NATO's behavioral research, and to the scientists who turned a moral question into a tool of absolute control. These experiences are what led me to dig deeper, not into prison psychopaths, which was their focus, but into the ones who never end up behind bars, the ones who sit in boardrooms, government offices, and research labs, shaping systems that define how the rest of us live. And here again, all along the way, defining what is normal. I really wanted to understand how this concept moved beyond hospital wards and courtrooms into the worlds of military psychology, intelligence work, and eventually the NATO's behavioral programs. At that time, I'd also been an avid reader of true crime, and I couldn't stop asking myself, what about the ones who don't get caught? The ones who blend in, who thrive? The statistics never made sense to me. Robert Hare claimed that maybe 1% of the general population are psychopaths, yet in his own research on prison populations, he said it was 1 in 4. That gap between 1% and 25% suggested something larger, something structural, not just personal pathology. Hervey Cleckley defined what that mask was in his book, Mask of Sanity, that charming surface that hides the disorder underneath. Robert Hare, of course, inherited it and turned it into a checklist. Together, they built a closed system. One man, Cleckley, described what a psychopath looks like. The other, Robert Hare, built the tools to find him. And here's the real irony: the people who claim to spot psychopaths have to wear the same kind of mask themselves, hiding parts of who they are so the light never shines back on them. What ties Cleckley and Hare together isn't just shared research, it's control. Control over the meaning of the word psychopath, and by extension, control over who gets labeled, studied, and excluded. So these are the two main names tied to modern research on psychopathy. Hervey Cleckley, author of The Mask of Sanity in 1941, often called the godfather of psychopathy. And Robert Hare, a Canadian psychologist who for more than 40 years has said that he inherited and refined Cleckley's work. I first noticed that Hare didn't just follow Cleckley's ideas, that overlap wasn't after the fact. It happened when Cleckley was still alive. The connection between them isn't rumor or theory. It's documented in their own words, shared writings, mutual acknowledgments, and even Cleckley's personal book notes referencing Hare. I've spoken about parts of this story before, often as context within shows I recorded, but never all in one place. My goal here is to bring it together, every thread, no matter how long, into one coherent recording. I can now trace the diagnostic lineage straight into NATO's behavior science programs. What emerges is a continuous professional line. Cleckley, the wartime psychiatrist whose mask of sanity defined the modern concept of psychopathy, passes the torch to Hare, who turned it into the psychopathy checklist. The PCL series now used in prisons, court systems, and security screenings worldwide. Follow that chain forward, and it leads directly into military and intelligence psychology, the same bureaucratic networks that grew into NATO's psychological and behavioral screening apparatus. Robert Hare's system didn't just measure psychopathy, it defined it in a way that perfectly served courts, prisons, and bureaucracies, not science. Robert Hare's PCLR gives a simple score, a number you can defend in court. It turns a complex personality construct into something that looks objective, a checklist, a cutoff, a label. That made it irresistible to the legal system. Judges, parole boards, and forensic evaluators wanted something quantifiable to justify decisions that were actually moral and political. Who's dangerous? Who deserves freedom? So Robert Hare built them a metric and then controlled access to it. By embedding criminality inside the definition itself, Robert Hare's checklist ensured that anyone already in the system, inmates, defendants, the institutionalized, would score higher. In practice, the test didn't just detect antisocial traits, it reproduced the criminal class on paper. And that's where these researchers, Scheme and Cook, came into the picture. They objected. They wanted to do more work into this psychopathy thing. They wanted to look into psychopaths outside of the prison system. They were saying that people weren't psychopaths because they were criminals. They were labeled criminals because the diagnostic tool was written to find psychopathy in criminal behavior. And then Robert Hare, of course, had control over the scale. He also had control over the licensing, the royalties, the training, and that meant that every researcher or clinician had to play by his rules. Critics risked lawsuits or blacklisting from forensic contracts. That's not scientific consensus, that's a closed market of definitions. And in that market, psychopath became a brand, a profitable label sold to the justice system. Once psychopathy was re engineered as a forensic number, it became a tool of classification. Courts used it to lengthen sentences, deny parole, or justify indefinite detention. Governments used it to train risk assessment software. It functioned less as medicine and more as data governance over human unpredictability, a perfect continuation of psychiatry's Cold War role in managing deviance. The man often called the godfather of psychopathy is American psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley. Cleckley was the first to describe the successful psychopath, intelligent, articulate, and outwardly normal, but emotionally hollow and morally detached. Decades later, Canadian psychologist Robert D. Hare took Cleckley's blueprint and turned it into a measurable scale. He called it the Psychopathy Checklist, or the PCLR, which became the global standard in prisons, courts, and security institutions. Their combined work, Cleckley's theory and Hare's instrument, shaped modern forensic psychology and quietly influenced how Western law enforcement and defense organizations, including NATO linked security programs, came to classify and manage high risk personalities. After Robert Hare attended a conference with NATO, that connection became clear. The modern idea of the psychopath, a person who appears sane yet lacks conscience, did not originate in medical neutrality, but in the Cold War fusion of psychiatry, behavioral science, and military psychology. In the 1940s, Cleckley defined the mask of sanity while practicing shock and coma therapies typical of that course of era. Cleckley also testified at the Ted Bundy trial, the first televised trial in the United States, to further, in the public's mind, define what a psychopath is. But before I get started on all these tests, let's talk about this ink blot business, or the Rorschach, Rorschach, and the rise of behavioral control. Because in the past, the PCLR did not include this Rorschach deal, okay? The ink blot. Just think of it in terms of ink blots, okay? So Robert Hare's model did not include this Rorschach model, the ink blot model. But now that, and I'm only guessing here, and now that Carl Gacono is taking over from Robert Hare, Carl Gacono is very much into this inkblot Rorschach business. So even now, figures like Carl Gacono cling to the Rorschach partly because it preserves the clinician's interpretive authority, a way to read the soul when checklists and data cannot. And that's what I found very interesting, because by throwing this ink blot into this PCLR thing, what'll happen is you get a certain score, right? Well, okay, you get this score, they say you're a psychopath, right? Or maybe you don't get a score. Maybe the score indicates you're not a psychopath, right? Well, then where the ink blot comes in is they get to interpret that. So you take these quantifiable tests and now you turn it into this ink blot deal, right? So then the clinician can override things and say, wait a minute here. But according to this Rorschach thing, we're becoming the judge here, right? So a single interpretive report could determine whether someone was treated, confined, or released, not based on verifiable data, but on the examiner's reading of ink blots. In that sense, the test did more than measure personality, it preserved professional power. So, where did this Rorschach thing come from? Well, it came from a guy named Herman Rorschach, lived 1884 to 1922, born in Zurich, Switzerland. He was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Rorschach was fascinated by how people saw shapes and patterns, especially ink blots, which children often played with in Switzerland, a pastime known as hexography. He noticed that people's descriptions of these blots seemed to reveal stable personality traits. So, while working in psychiatric hospitals, he began experimenting systematically with 10 standard blots printed in black, gray, and color. He used them to study how perception and imagination differed in schizophrenia and other mental disorders. So Rorschach died in 1922, a year after publishing his thing, and at age 37. But after his death, others expanded the test. A couple of people from Germany brought it to America in the 1930s to the 40s. It became a major projective test during the psychoanalytical era of the 1940s to the 1960s. So it was kind of a big deal early on, this ink blot business, right? And but basically, I don't know. It appears like most professional people have discredited this ink blot theory. So, but the ink blot theory, the Rorschach thing, entered the U.S. military and intelligence psychology. Post World War One, after the ink, I'm sorry about this word, Rorschach appeared in 1921, the ink blot test was translated into English and German. Early adopters, such as Samuel Beck, Bruno Klopfer, and Margaret Hertz, introduced it into U.S. hospitals and graduate programs. It was viewed as a way to access the unconscious, a bridge between psychiatry and psychoanalysis. By the late 1930s, the test was being used in American clinics, mental hospitals, and several major universities. So, when the U.S. Army needed a fast way to screen recruits and officers for emotional stability, it turned to psychologists trained in these methods. So, they used the Rorschach along with the thematic appearance test and sentence completion test. They became part of the military's projective battery. And to keep all this straight in everybody's minds, how this really works is this: the U.S. government or military does the funding for these things, okay? The universities and the hospitals are the ones who carry out these events, torture, or whatever you want to call them, that's taking place. So, military psychiatrists were asked to identify who might break under pressure or who might be suitable for intelligence or counter espionage roles. So then, first of all, we had the psychologists in the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services. That was the forerunner of the CIA. They used these tests to evaluate spies, informants, and double agents. The assumption was that a trained analyst could read an operative's character from symbolic responses. So after the war, OSS psychologists carried these methods into academia, and the new CIA, Air Force, and Navy psychiatric divisions. Projective testing aligned perfectly with Cold War ideology, psychology as an instrument of national security and loyalty prediction. Government funded laboratories and university departments, many attached to defense contracts, developed personality assessment programs. The Rorschach ink blot test became standard in military hospital and veteran screening centers. Psychiatrists like Hervey, Cleckley, and other military clinicians drew on this climate when linking psychopathy to predictability and behavioral control. Because how it got started was the GI Bill sent thousands of former officers into psychological graduate programs. Training manuals in the 1950s to 60s taught that projective tests could reveal the inner enemy. The Rorschach inkblot became a rite of passage in clinical education, not because it was reliable, but because it symbolized expert intuition backed by military experience. But with the rise of cognitive and behavioral psychology, researchers began asking hard questions. What does an inkblot actually measure? Do two clinicians scoring the same test result come to the same conclusions? Studies revealed low reliability, cultural bias, and minimal predictive value. By the 1990s, meta analysis by Wood, Lingfield, and Garb dismantled its forensic credibility. Yet, in some corners, especially among forensic clinicians like Carl Gacono, the Rorschach survived as a symbol of deep authority, the clinician's final word when data felt too impersonal. The Rorschach endured not because it worked, but because it met institutional needs. It gave psychologists a language of hidden insight for bureaucracy seeking certainty. It offered intelligence and defense agencies a way to disguise intuition as science. It reinforced the notion that a trained expert could see through deception, whether in a soldier, a spy, or a prisoner. So, in short, the Rorschach began as a Swiss psychiatrist experiment in perception. By mid century, it had become an instrument of behavioral governance, a tool for deciding who could serve, who could be trusted, and who could be contained. That transition from therapy to surveillance is a real story of its endurance. But when World War II ended, the United States and its allies did not dismantle their psychological screening programs, they repurposed them. What began as wartime intelligence testing quietly evolved into Cold War science of human management. Doctors returning from Army and Naval hospitals brought their techniques into universities and Veterans Administration clinics. Among them was Hervey Cleckley, the Georgian psychiatrist who had tested soldiers during and after the war. His 1941 book, The Mask of Sanity, describes psychopaths as people who look normal but lacked conscience. After 1945, this concept fit perfectly with a new security mindset, enemies who wore friendly faces. Cleckley's hospital became a feeder for research on character disorders. Cleckley experimented with deep sleep therapies, vitamins, and electroshock, early efforts to reset damaged personalities. Cleckley's patients were often veterans or defense employees, and his methods echoed those later used in CIA projects, Bluebird, Artichoke, and MK Ultra, all aimed at probing the limits of behavioral control. By the 1950s, the U.S. was exporting not only weapons, but behavioral science. NATO's psychological divisions, especially in the UK, Canada, and Belgium, drew directly from American military psychiatry. They adopted the same logic to predict threat, study personality. Projective tests such as the Rorschach and TAT were used to screen recruits, select officers, and identify defectors or subversives. Cleckley's charming conscious deficit type became a model for detecting loyalty risk, the enemy within. By the late 1950s, NATO linked laboratories were running coordinated behavioral analysis programs. Clinical diagnosis had become behavioral prediction, a method of sorting populations by risk. And we went from Cleckley to Robert Hare. In the 1970s, Canadian psychologist Robert Hare standardized Cleckley's loose description of the psychopath into the psychopathy checklist, or the PCL. Although Hare's tool appeared scientific, it grew from the same Cold War soil, the desire to classify and control. Where the Rorschach relied on symbols, Hare relied on data, but the goal remained prediction. The PCL quickly became a cornerstone of prison and forensic evaluations across NATO countries. Robert Hare openly credited Cleckley as his model. He did not replace Cleckley's worldview, he quantified it. So by the 1990s, some clinicians felt Hare's checklist was too mechanical. This allowed Carl Gacono and J. Reed McGloy to reintroduce the Rorschach as a way to see inside the checklist scores. They presented it as a quantitative complement to quantitative risk assessment, restoring the clinician's authority to interpret the soul behind the score. In forensic settings, this gave experts immense influence. A few paragraphs of interpretation could justify continued confinement under the label of psychopathic structure. So, across 70 years, it remained the same. The Rorschach read the hidden mind. Cleckley named it the moral deficit. Robert Hare scored the risk. And Carl Gacono seems to be interpreting the depth. Each claimed greater precisions, but all reinforce a hierarchy in which clinicians and institutions held final authority over who was sane, safe, or free. But the Rorschach may have died as a science, but it survived as a symbol, the belief that experts can see what others can't. That idea traveled from Swiss hospitals to American intelligence labs, from Cleckley's wards to NATO's research centers, and into courtrooms where both inkblots and checklists became tools of control. So, and the question that remains is not whether the tests worked, but who do they serve? There's this other thing I'm going to introduce here, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. They're now coming up with this thing called the aggressivity cluster, sometimes called the aggression cluster. Was created by Craig Malloy and Carl Gacono in the early 1990s during their efforts to interpret Rorschach inkblot test responses of violent antisocial individuals, especially psychopaths and sexual offenders. So they have this other thing called, it's something about to measure how aggressive people are. I'm not going to go a lot into it. I'm just pointing it out. You may run across it. But this aggressivity cluster was often used in forensic evaluations of violent offenders, sexual predators, and institutionalized psychopathic patients. The research for this thing was compared Rorschach pattern of psychopathy versus non-psychopathic criminals. Well, anyway, so the cluster and Gacono's forensic Rorschach system more broadly drew heavy criticism from mainstream psychologists for several reasons. This inkblot business has low empirical validation. Few independent studies replicated his findings. So, circular reasoning, the Rorschach found aggression in populations already known to be violent. Well, yeah, you're studying prisoners, right? Forensic risk. Courts increasingly viewed such projective data as subjective and inadmissible, especially after the Daubert standard tightened expert evidence rules. So, yeah, so that is that inkblot business and this other thing that they came up with. And there's some more I'll be talking about in just a little bit here. There's this one test that Robert Hare then came up. I literally could not stop laughing the whole time I was reading about this test, but I'll keep going along here. We'll get to there in a bit here. So, yeah, so all that business, and now they're bringing in back in this ink block business. So, um, where the word psychopath come from? Well, psychopath comes from the Greek, meaning psyche of the mind or pathos of the suffering. It appeared in German psychiatry in the 1880s when physicians like Julius Koch used the phrase psychopathic inferiority to describe mental abnormalities that weren't full insanity. So the term spread across Europe, especially in Germany, France, and Britain, as a way to describe personality disorders or moral defects. By the early 1900s, psychopathic personality was a common medical term, especially in the work of Kurt Schneider, whose 1923 book defined such people as those whose abnormal traits cause suffering to themselves or others. It was a broad, moralized concept, more about ethics and control than medicine. And just to give you a little bit of history, NATO just didn't spring up out of the air. They have had intelligence agencies from the very beginning, starting in the 1889s with the Germans. It later expanded into propaganda and earlier psychological operations, studying how emotion and information could shape behavior. And then, of course, the Russians focused on internal surveillance and infiltration of revolutionary groups, operating secret outposts in Paris and Geneva. And of course, France was involved. It handled military intelligence, cryptography, and counter espionage, and became infamous during the Dreyfus Affair, when secret intelligence and prejudice destroyed an innocent officer's life. So, yeah, so I have the whole list over on my website if you want to take a look, because it started off in Germany, and then Britain didn't really have a war office until the 1870s, but MI5, MI6 would appear around 1909. And the United States, yeah, they all these agencies were pre-NATO. So so none of this is really a coincidence, okay? It all kind of ran through the same thing, because the roots of NATO's later behavioral research stretch all the way back to this moment when science and secrecy first learned to speak the same language. The word psychopath was born in the same generation that created the first spy agencies, both products of a world obsessed with classifying minds, motives, and threats. When The Mask of Sanity came out in 1941, the United States was preparing for war. Cleckley expressed concern about psychopathic individuals within the military, a topic that lined up perfectly with the new world of intelligence screening and loyalty testing. His appendix was titled Not a Single Spies, but in Battalions, reflected that same systematic view, psychopaths not as isolated cases, but as groups, as patterns, as risk of the whole. So yeah, so right after Cleckley came up with this, the OSS, the first CIA, was invented. So then we can fast forward to the 2000s, and the field is dominated by Hare's checklist, a tool licensed, copywritten, and sold through one private company. So I'll talk a little bit about these researchers, Jennifer Skeem, that's Skeem, and David Cook. And I will be sending a copy of the show to the researchers I'm talking about, including Robert Hare, Carl Okono, Jennifer Skeem, and David Cook. They will also get a copy of this show. And if anybody has anything that I've said is wrong, I am very open to making any changes possible. So let's talk about Jennifer Skeem and David Cook. Skeem is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and studies psychopathy, violence, and criminal justice reform. Cook is a forensic psychologist in Scotland, has spent decades building structured risk assessment tools and pushing for scientific transparency. Together, they became two of the most respected and most dangerous critics of Hare's empire. In the mid 2000s, they published research arguing that the PCLR was too narrow, too rigid, and too influential. They raised three key issues. Conceptual. Hare's version treated psychopathy as a single fixed disorder centered on criminal behavior. Skeem and Cook argue that traits like lack of empathy or manipulation can exist outside of crime, meaning the model was based toward finding psychopathy only in prisoners. Statistical. Skeem and Cook found that Hare's two-factor model didn't replicate across cultures or samples. They proposed a three-factor structure that captured more nuance. And then there were concerns over ethical and legal issues. Scheme and Cook warned that courts were using the PCLR to brand people for life, even when the test wasn't applied consistently or trained properly. That misuse could lead to wrongful sentencing and indefinite confinement. When their paper was ready for publication, Robert Hare threatened to sue them. He claimed their critique misrepresented his work and delayed the paper's release for nearly 3 years. The academic world was outraged because science depends on open criticism. Robert Hare's reaction looked less like scholarship and more like censorship. When Psychological Assessment finally published the paper, it became a landmark in scientific ethics, a warning about what happens when one man owns a definition. Scheme and Cook weren't just nitpicking his theories, they were sounding the alarm. Psychiatry had crossed a line from describing minds to manufacturing evidence for state control. Their message was simple, that psychopathy is a spectrum, that science must stay open, and that no one should own a concept that powerful. Their critique asked psychology to reclaim its conscience, and that's why Hare fought back. They weren't just challenging a theory, they were threatening the system that grew from it. Robert Hare's PCLR turned a human idea into a bureaucratic algorithm, a weapon dressed as diagnosis. And let's talk about a couple of other things that Robert Hare has done in the past. Robert Hare hooked up with a couple I would call fairly questionable people to promote his psychopath idea. The first one he picked out was a man named Sam Vaknin, Vaknin. I first ran across Sam around 1994. At that time, he was running a MSN group about narcissism. Then he switched to saying he was a psychiatrist. At first, Sam Vaknin claimed he was a narcissist. Then he said he was a psychopath. And I don't know where he stands now, but he's got a big following over on YouTube. He's still alive and well and selling his lives. So first one we're going to talk about is Sam Vaknin. So the second one was a guy named John Ronson, Ronson. John Ronson turned the word psychopath into a pop culture meme. But before that, we had Vaknin. Vaknin is a Israeli writer. Some claim he has ties to Israeli intelligence. I don't know. Probably. But, anyways, he built an online following in the 1990s with a self published book called Malignant Self Love Narcissism Revisited. He marketed himself as a diagnosed narcissist, explaining the condition from the inside. He had no clinical license and a checkered past. He served prison time in Israel for his stock fraud convictions, but his website became one of his first big internet forums on narcissistic abuse. Over time, he expanded his claims, portraying himself as a kind of self taught authority on narcissism, psychopathy, and antisocial personality. He called himself Doctor, though his degree came from Pacific Western University, an uncredited school later shut down by Hawaiian regulators. His public persona rested on contradictions. He was a convicted criminal, a self described genius, unlicensed mental health expert. And because he was early to the internet, he built a loyal audience that treated him as both victim and visionary. And he actually got Robert Hare to collaborate with him. And I have so many links on my website. You'll link yourself to pieces, okay? I have links to the copy of this movie. It's called Psychopathy from 2009. I watched it again myself a few weeks ago. So what happened was this was Robert Hare was like, I'm just guessing here, right? Obviously trying to push his ideas about psychopath. He hooks up with Sam Vaknin, who I know most reasonable people consider Vaknin to be problematic. So They did this movie called I, Psychopath in 2009. The Australian Broadcast Corporation aired a documentary called I, Psychopath, directed by Ian Walker. The film followed Vaknin and his partner on a road trip across Europe while he underwent psychological testing to see whether he met the criteria for psychopathy. Several clinicians appeared briefly on camera, including Robert Hare, then the world's best known expert on the psychopathy checklist, the PCLR. Hare allowed the filmmakers to record part of a conversation and a short testing demonstration. His mere presence led legitimacy to the entire production. The documentary, well, that's what they're calling it, played like a mix of experiment and reality show. A self proclaimed narcissist confronting science to find out if he was a psychopath. For Hare, it was a chance to showcase his test to a mass audience. For Vaknin, it was priceless publicity. But of course, the film blurred the lines, right? The film blurred the line between science, spectacle, and self promotion. Hare's appearance gave the show credibility it really didn't deserve. Vatkin used the exposure to strengthen his brand as the narcissist who knows he's one. But psychologists quickly criticized the documentary for trivializing serious diagnostics, and an echo of this backlash would later greet John Ronson, who came up with a thing called the Psychopath test. When criticism mounted, Robert Hare claimed his segment had been edited unfairly and minimized his involvement. Vaknin's background didn't help. He'd served 18 months in prison for securities fraud, and his PhD was unaccredited. His boastful claims like IQ of 185 were self-reporting marketing, not verified facts. And since the PCLR requires trained in-person evaluation, no television program could legitimately diagnose psychopathy on air. In short, the film turned the field into theater. The I Psychopath episode showed just how far the concept of psychopathy had drifted from research to reality TV. By 2010, psychopathy wasn't just a forensic term, it had become a media brand circulating through talk shows, YouTube channels, and self help forums. Every collaboration, Robert Hare with Vaknin, Robert Hare with John Ronson, extended the reach but diluted the science. When the criticism got loud, Robert Hare again claimed he'd been misused, yet he still benefited from the visibility that kept his checklist in the headlines. The bottom line is this: the movie I Psychopath wasn't a one off stunt. It was a symptom of a bigger shift. Psychopathy as entertainment, and Hare, intentionally or not, serving as his gatekeeper in chief. Inside the profession, there was mild embarrassment, but no formal reprimand, because the film aired mostly in Australia and Europe. Many clinicians simply missed it. By the time anyone noticed Hare had appeared alongside a convicted fraudster, the moment had passed. The objection stayed private. Hallway chatter at conferences, not public condemnation. But a few years later, journalist John Ronson, best known for the book The Man Who Stares at Goats, went looking for the same experts. John Ronson met Robert Hare while researching what became the Psychopath test of 2011. Hare likely saw Ronson as a useful amplifier, a smart, media savvy writer who could popularize decades of work. Ronson attended one of Hare's certification workshops, courses that cost thousands per trainee, and received informal guidance on how to spot psychopaths. At first, Hare welcomed the attention. Ronson's book, promised to spread the PCLR's authority far beyond courtrooms and labs. When the Psychopath test came out, it became an international hit because it blurred the lines between serious psychology and social satire. Ronson roamed through Silicon Valley, the BBC, and political circles, casually applying Hare's checklist to CEOs, politicians, and media figures. His punchline was irresistible. Maybe we're all a little psychopathic. That sentence sold books and filled TED Talks, but it flattened decades of science into a meme. Hare's prison based test was now being used as a cocktail party psychology. And this time, clinicians were furious. Courts and journalists were citing pop versions of the checklist, while real defendants faced life changing decisions based on it. For a field still recovering from the Scheme and Cook controversy, the media circus was disastrous. When the backlash hit, Hare distanced himself again. He said Ronson exaggerated and misrepresented him, but the association stuck. Ronson, meanwhile, leaned into the irony. He turned the backlash into part of his act, admitting that he'd become obsessed with labeling people and wondered whether the obsession was itself a little psychopathic. He transformed the critique into entertainment, and that saved him. The deeper story was about scale. Hare's model had escaped the lab and become a cultural meme. Ronson's journalism was its marketing campaign. Hare provided scientific weight. Ronson provided reach. When the professional community pushed back, each man claimed innocence. Hare said he was misquoted. Ronson said he was joking. But together, they mainstreamed a moral idea as if it were clinical fact. Some people are born without empathy and turned it into a shorthand for evil in an age of social media judgments and algorithmic profiling. Ronson's humor made the message digestible. Hare's reputation made it credible. Between them, they transformed psychopathy from a diagnosis into a cultural commodity. And when the criticism arrived, they both blamed each other. Hare's pattern was consistent. He guarded the PCLR fiercely inside the profession, demanding licensing and training fees. Yet he relaxed those boundaries when media exposure offered new audiences. He could appear in a sensational documentary, protect his proprietary rights, and claim later that editing distorted his words. His experience with Vaknin in 29 probably gave him false confidence. That film had earned attention but little blowback. So when Ronson appeared 2 years later, Hare repeated the formula: provide controlled access to the real science. Let the charismatic outsider do the storytelling and reap the attention. But this time, the exposure exploded beyond control. The Ronson book became a bestseller and a TED phenomenon. Clinicians and journalists everywhere were quoting the PCLR often inaccurately. And then there's Hare's 1% soundbite. Hare claimed that 1 in 100 people are psychopaths, and that got repeated as gospel. It sounded precise, scientific, and alarming. But it wasn't based on broad population data. It was a rhetorical anchor, a simple number that gave authority to his brand. In reality, psychopathy exists on a spectrum, not a switch. People can show a few traits without showing them all. So when Robert Hare came up with this tidy 1% figure, he did two things. It made the disorder seem rare and mysterious, something only trained experts could detect. And it kept attention off the well socialized psychopaths, the ones in power who would never see a prison cell. So the public heard, trust the experts. We'll tell you the dangerous ones and who they are. And meanwhile, the same diagnostic logic was being used by institutions to manage risk, rank behavior, and police emotion at a scale. By the 2010s, psychopathy had become a global shorthand for evil. That's as much to television, YouTube, and TED Talks as to journals or courts. Robert Hare had wanted control and credibility. Instead, he got something harder to manage: fame. He spent decades defining the mask, and then the media world put it on. Whether it was Sam Vaknin's narcissistic guru routine or John Ronson's ironic humor, every public partnership amplified the myth and blurred the science. Each time, Robert Hare stepped forward for the spotlight, then back into the shadows when it turned harsh. Inside his own profession, that dual identity still defines him: gatekeeper and showman, scientist and salesman, the man who gave us the mask and still insists he's the only one qualified to remove it. There's two phases of the spectrum. I see the behavioral spectrum as continuous. At one end are the unsocialized psychopaths, impulsive, violent, easy to spot and condemn. On the other are the socialized psychopaths, calculating, image conscious, rewarded for charm and ruthlessness. They don't rob banks, they rob nations. And we praise them as visionaries, disruptors, or reformers. By keeping the diagnosis focused on the most blatant cases, the system protects the upper tier, the ones who write laws, who run corporations, and shape economies. Robert Hare, 1 in 100 claim, wasn't science, it was optics. It reduced a moral and structural issue to a tiny clinical number, masking the scale of psychopathy's social reach behind a statistic. The 1% framing works like a sedative. It makes people feel safe in a world that may actually be run by the very personality type being minimized. When you tell the public that psychopaths are rare, you give them permission to stop looking. It's comforting to think the danger ones live in prisons, not in boardrooms. But the same traits that get one person locked up, deceit, callousness, exploitation, get another promoted. The rare exception story keeps the gatekeeper's hands clean. The unsocialized psychopath robs a store. The socialized one engineers a collapse, loots the pensions, and sells a $1 trillion illusion. Both lack conscience. Only one gets stock options and a keynote slot at Davos. The result is elegant containment, a diagnostic fence that keeps society looking downward at the obvious predators instead of upward at the systematic ones. People are left scanning the streets for monsters while the boardroom version builds the world around them. For psychiatry, law enforcement, and the courts, keeping the label narrow is a survival strategy. If psychopathy were treated as a continuum from subtle moral numbness to predatory exploitation, the instruments would implicate the institutions themselves. By defining evil as rare and external, the system protects its own legitimacy. The disorder became a pathology of individuals, never of structures. That's how a language built to describe moral failure turned into a tool of risk management. When the checklist replaced reflection, psychopathy stopped being a mirror, it became a weapon. It let bureaucracies measure deviance without ever asking why they produce it. Robert Hare didn't just build a test, he built an economy. He owned the checklist through his publisher, Multi Health Systems or MHS, and required paid training for anyone who wanted to use it. He licensed it to prisons, universities, and courts around the world, creating a steady revenue stream and a closed circle of certified experts. Robert Hare controlled the translations, the data, and even the critiques. That's what turned psychopathy from a public concept into personal private property. Robert Hare became the solace of the diagnosis and the regulator of who could apply it. So when critics like Jennifer Scheme and David Cook questioned his methods or data, he didn't meet them in open debate. He threatened a legal action. Journals delayed publication for years out of fear. It was an early warning sign of how science can morph into brand defense. Through his structure, Robert Hare created a self reinforcing system. He defined the phenomena. He controlled access to the measurement. He profits from its use. He decides who's qualified to speak. He also discourages rivals through cost or intimidation. I would have to say, if gatekeeping were an Olympic sport, Robert Hare would have earned the lifetime gold. Robert Hare managed to capture every link in the chain, from the idea to the instrument, the licensing, the training, and the vocabulary, and wrap it in a commercial and legal shell that made replacement nearly impossible. By the 1980s, the field had split into two bureaucratic empires. Psychology under Hare privatized psychopathy, a paid certification system sold to courts and researchers. And then under psychiatry, under the American Psychiatric Association, it bureaucratized it, folding antisocial behavior into the DSM so it could be coded, billed, and medicated. So what happened was this was the split between Hare and psychologists was another big bureaucratic split, right? The people that produced the DSM, they came up with their own theories. So Hare's checklist eventually defined the dangerous criminal mind, but the DSM defined the treatable behavioral patient. Neither touched the everyday manipulator who hides in plain sight. Together, they built a closed circuit of legitimacy, one for the courtroom, one for the clinic, while the real human story fell through the cracks. And here's how the sampling got trapped from the beginning. Both Hare studies and the DSM criteria were built on prison populations, men already convicted, already categorized. Those were convenient samples. They were captive, they were documented, and they were cheap. But once those data were exported to describe human nature, the bias came with them. The result was a diagnostic mirror calibrated to reflect only the powerless. The frameworks were built on the incarcerated and then applied to everyone else. So our collective image of the psychopath became the violent inmate, not the charming executive. In effect, the science policed the bottom of the hierarchy while flattening the top. The tools that were supposed to detect exploitation ended up reinforcing it. Today's functional psychopath does not lurk in alleys. He runs meetings, manages funds, and headlines charity galas. He builds the systems that reward his traits, then sells redemption through philanthropy. He is the respectable face of the same disorder the prison system condemns. And psychiatry, for its part, has no exit plan. It was never structured around healing, it was built for management. First of soldiers, then of prisoners, now of populations. It runs on the illusion of safety through measurement. The mask of sanity has simply become the mask of respectability. That's the real continuity from Cleckley to Hare. The same emotional emptiness, dressed for each other's era's audiences. from the asylum to the boardroom, from the clipboard to the balance sheet. And then enter Carl Gacono. Carl had written to me twice about this new book they wrote about female psychopathy. I did not respond. I probably should have responded and say, leave me out of this, but I didn't. I just said nothing. So maybe I should have said something. I don't know. I was pretty Well, I was very inflamed about the title of this book that he wanted me to participate in, called The Female Psychopath, because what I felt at the time was that they would probably use this data to go in and get females identified and locked up for longer sentences. That was my feeling at the time, and it still remains my feelings today. So, Carl Gacono, hold on a second. I believe Carl Gacono is taking over for Robert Hare. Do I have proof of it? No, it says on his website, contact Carl Gacono if you want any references. So anyway, so he became the first to publish a book-length treatment explicitly on female psychopaths. And these works presented women as not merely as hysterical or borderline, but as potentially true psychopaths, a category the early PCLR mostly reserved for men. It was an attempt to extend Hare's checklist logic into female populations. So rather than challenging Hare's framework, Gacconi replicated it under a new demographic lens. It opened the checklist economy to new funding, new forensic training, and new treatment programs. So, by labeling women psychopaths, the system reasserted control over a group previously coded as emotional or manipulative in different clinical terms. So, the move from Hare back to Gacono with his inkblot business is less about scientific discovery than about maintaining institutional momentum. Each generation of researchers expands the diagnostic net. First, the criminal class, then executives, now women, ensuring the framework never loses relevance or funding. So, yeah, so I think that Carl Gacono is effectively the next custodian of Hare's empire, repackaging psychopathy for a new demographic while preserving the same central authority structure. Gacono's focus on female psychopathy didn't dismantle the system, it expanded its reach, keeping alive the same logic of control, classification, and monetization that began with Cleckley's veterans and Hare's prisons. So, when you map it out historically, the pattern is unmistakable. Each key figure operated inside or alongside state or military hospitals where psychiatry, security, and research funding overlapped. And I did a tracer on Cleckley. I can't confirm Cleckley's involvement with the MK7 for obvious reasons. They destroyed all the records. So, but Cleckley has a pretty serious past, and that always surprised me about Robert Hare, because for 40 years he said he based his work on Cleckley. Well, you look up Cleckley, he was involved in the Three Faces of Eve, all kinds of horrible stuff. He was putting people into comas and mental institutions. He was studying this thing called pellagra, which is pumping people full of corn to see how sick they get. So yeah, so it always kind of struck me as odd that Robert Hare was saying, "Yeah, I based 40 years of my work on this guy." I guess maybe he didn't bother to figure out what Cleckley had been doing, or maybe nobody thought anybody would look. But okay, so let's take a sharper look at Cleckley. He came directly out of the military. Okay, I traced all of his work. Cleckley's base of work was at the University Hospital in Augusta, Georgia, as a consultant psychiatrist. And then he was at a U.S. Army hospital called Camp Gordon during World War II. He treated veterans with neuropsychiatric casualties. So, supposedly, his book, The Mask of Sanity, grew directly out of case files from those wards. men judged charming but amoral. So while Cleckley was at Camp Gordon, they fed data to the U.S. Surgeon General's Psychiatric Division, which coordinated with early OSS Army intelligence programs. So Cleckley's work sat at the intersection, the direct intersection of military screening, behavioral medicine, and early security classification. Then we have Robert Hare, born in 1934. He based his work at the University of British Columbia with a research at federal prisons and psychiatric units in Canada. See how all these things are starting to wind together? Robert Hare was a consultant to corrections, police, and NATO aligned forensic networks. Robert Hare, his funding and access, his PCLR data was gathered inside penitentiaries and secure hospitals, environments structurally descendant from wartime psychiatry. And of course, Hare converted Cleckley's clinical impressions into a quantitative tool tailored for justice and security bureaucracies, a Cold War fusion of psychology and risk management. And of course, we have Carl Gacono. He was born in the 1950s. He obviously also comes out of the same background. His base of his work was in U.S. federal prison systems, initially as a staff psychologist at Leavenworth, then the Veterans Administration and private forensic clinics. He is a forensic evaluator and trainee of PCLR assessors, later director of clinical services within correctional facilities. Gacono extended Hare's framework to female offenders and special populations, veterans, and sex offenders. So there's a continuity between them all. Gacono obviously was also in the same settings, prisons and VA hospitals, the same closed environments where psychiatry, law enforcement, and government funding coverage. The setting is always state controlled, military, prison, or government hospitals. Their clientele is captive, soldiers, inmates, wards of the state. The research is dual use, therapeutic on paper, administrative in practice. This continuity shows that psychopathy research was never just academic curiosity. It evolved inside systems designed to classify and manage human risk, first for war readiness, then for prison control, and now for forensic prediction. The clinical language masks an enduring political function, separating the manageable citizens from the dangerous ones, using psychiatry as the gate. So, in short, the godfather of psychopathy in the 1940s connects directly to the godfather of psychopathy today, and both are woven into the fabric of Cold War and NATO era military intelligence. And it's really funny because all this time, up until just a few months ago, I really thought NATO was about planes, war, and military details. And here we are. There they are. Hello, NATO. We all see you, directly tied to the very definition of psychopath. Who could have guessed, right? Who could have guessed? I have spoken a lot about NATO in the past. I'm not going to go into there right now. But good morning, NATO. How are you lovely people doing over there today? Munching on some of those delicious Belgium chocolates? So, from its founding in 1949, NATO presented itself as a defensive pact built on transparency and shared democratic values. Yet behind the rhetoric of unity and deterrence lies an organization shaped by secrecy, overlapping jurisdictions, and a culture of classified operations. This opacity, once justified by the Cold War, has made NATO vulnerable to internal corruption, covert exploitation, and geopolitical manipulation. By the 21st century, the alliance's logistical and intelligence systems had become so intertwined with U.S. defense infrastructure that accountability often vanished in the gray zone between national and allied activity. Procurement networks, private contractors, and covert transport corridors have all exploited that ambiguity. NATO's layered command structure was designed for rapid coordination, not public scrutiny. Classified procurement processes, closed financial reporting, and immunity clauses for personnel collectively form a system where oversight is minimal. The alliance's internal audit bodies, the Internal International Board of Auditors, and the NATO Offices of Resources have limited enforcement power, and national governments often hide between security exemptions to block disclosure. Defense contracting has always been fertile ground for corruption, but NATO's multi state structure amplifies the risk. Each contract may involve multiple suppliers, currencies, and jurisdictions, complicating audits and enabling shell companies to thrive. Analysts from Transparency International and the Carnegie Endowment have repeatedly warned that rapid spending, especially after 2022, created ideal conditions for procurement fraud. So there's a lot going on with NATO, and I'm not going to go about every little detail here, but I have quite a few of them listed on my website. So there was one period I will discuss because it's pretty important. Between 2003 and 2007, the alliance's shared infrastructure became the backbone of U.S. counterterrorism operations. Council of Europe and European Parliament reports later confirmed that CIA extraordinary retention flights carrying detainees to secret prisons used NATO member airfields and refueling sites in Poland, Romania, Germany, and Italy. So, yeah, people are starting to pay attention. Human Rights Watch has said they link flights. So this period revealed NATO's most profound weakness. Its structure allowed the U.S. intelligence community to operate across Europe with near total deniability. When questioned, NATO points to national governments. When governments were questioned, they point back to NATO command. NATO's limited post conflict accountability mechanisms meant the operation ended with no responsibility for the regional chaos it unleashed. So, when NATO's greatest strength is its ability to operate as a unified force, is also its greatest weakness. When accountability questions arise, the alliance becomes a hall of mirrors. Member states claim NATO collective immunity. NATO claims national sovereignty. Contractors claim classified status. The diffusion of responsibility has allowed controversies from Afghanistan's opium boom to Balkan trafficking network to fade without legal closure. So let's start when all this started in the 1970s. Robert Hare published his first empirical papers translating Hervey Cleckley's description of the psychopath in immeasurable traits. Around the same time, the American Psychiatric Association is preparing the DSM 3, which will remove the word psychopath and introduce the word antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. Hare tried to warn that the DSM's behavior only approach misses the interpersonal and emotional core. But the APA replies that psychopathy is too subjective and moral. So basically, they started off in the 1980s. The DSM 3 in the 1980s officially replaces psychopathy with ASPD. And the same year, Robert Hare releases the Psychopathy checklist, the 1980 version, which was updated in 1991. So researchers start publishing dual studies, some using DSM criteria, others using Hare's PCLR criteria. The result, two data sets, two vocabularies, and growing confusion in courts and clinics. So in the 1990s, the power struggle peaks. Hare's PCLR becomes the forensic gold standard. The DSM-4, which came out in 1994, keeps the antisocial personality diagnosis unchanged. So then the academic fights erupt, and that happened with David Cook and Jennifer Scheme and others arguing that Hare's tool overstates criminality and lacks cultural neutrality. So then Robert Hare threatened defamation suits in the 2000s, freezing publication of some critiques for several years, solidifying his gatekeeper reputation. So around 2000 to 2010, the DSM-5, which came out in 2013, again declines to include psychopathy, despite lobbying by Hare supporters. So new research programs try compromise labels like psychopathic traits, callous unemotional traits, or dark triad. So forensic psychologists still rely on the PCLR for parole and sentencing. Psychiatrists stick to the ASPD for insurance and medication. Journals continue to publish comparative validity studies, none decisive enough to settle the debate. So yeah, and then of course in the 2020s, both frameworks coexist uneasily. Hare's checklist dominates legal and correctional settings, and the ASPD, antisocial personality, remains a clinical label of the DSM. So a lot of confusion going on, right? So this Robert Hare and the DSM feud has lasted about 50 years. Each side protects its own turf. Hare controls the forensic trademark. The APA controls a clinical billing code, and the resulting noise ensures no one else can own the definition. So, yeah, and it started right after the post war. Early editions of the DSM used vague moral language like sociopathic personality disturbance. There was no standard way to identify or measure antisocial personality behavior, so each psychiatrist relied on their own judgment. Meanwhile, sociologists and criminologists were building quantitative studies of delinquency, police reports, arrest rates, and court outcomes. When psychiatry decided it needed to look scientific, it borrowed those measurable behaviors. So, yeah, so in the 80s, this Robert Spritzer guy came out to rescue psychiatry, and then they came up with basically the bottom line is this, okay? Bottom line is this: what came out of all this confusion? Oh, massive, massive confusion, right? So if you keep two sides fighting for long enough, the chaos continues, right? So essentially, this is the way I see it. Robert Hare monetized the mask of evil, and the American Psychiatric Association monetized the paperwork of disorder. Both kept control by fragmenting the truth, one for the courtroom, the other for the clinic. And the real human story fell through the crack for 50 years while these people were all arguing, right? So, yeah, I've got all the ways they go back and forth, but so what happened was we inherited a distorted mirror, the psychopath as a violent, impulsive criminal. That image binds us to the subtler, systematic psychopathy expressed through charm, policy, finance, or medicine. So, in effect, it just made everybody more confused, right? Um, and that's where that, and out of that same era is where Hare came up with this 1% claim, because Robert Hare has long said that about 1% of the general population would meet criteria for psychopathy based on extrapolating from his prison research. His estimate came from applying the PCLR thresholds to community samples, not from population wide testing. Those studies were small and often skewed toward university students or job applicants, not the elites. So the 1% figure was more of an educated guess meant to dramatize that psychopaths exist outside prisons too. In prison studies, Hare found about 15 to 25% of inmates scored high enough to be labeled as psychopathic. That's because his tool was designed from inmate traits. The test fits the population that defined it. When you move that same test to the general population, the scores drop. The questions about criminal versatility, early behavior problems, parole violations no longer apply. So 1% in general is really a byproduct of a measurement mismatch. The PCLR isn't built to detect the boardroom psychopath. So, yeah, most people feel like that number is way too low. Um, Robert Hare's 1% sounds small, safe, and controlled, but it likely undercounts those who operate within the rules, not outside them. If you expand the frame beyond prisons to corporate and institutional life, the traits he described may be far more common, especially in places where ruthlessness is rewarded. So at one point, Robert Hare teamed up with a guy named Paul Babiak, Babiak, and they came up with another test. Uh, and I'll try very hard to be serious about this. Okay, so most workplace studies rely on self-report studies or subordinate feedback, and they use tools like they call it the B-Scan 360, and that was developed by Babiak and Hare. So, let me just not. I don't want to bury the lead here. First of all, the reason I started laughing so hard was because so why would you hire somebody to give the B scan? Well, let's say you're having some organizational problems and you think maybe you got some psychopaths running loose in your business or something, right? And you read Robert Hare and Paul Babiak's book called Psychopaths or Snakes in Suits or something like that. So you read this book and you think, hey, maybe we got to study the people within our own company. Well, so you get the human resources people to head this up. You go down. Hey, HR, we're gonna coordinate a survey within our own employees to see if we can find our own problems within. Right. Well, first of all, who are these employees? Right. They're people like you and me, right? Are they psychologists? Do they know how to rate psychopaths? Have they ever met a psychopath? I mean, and how many people would really truthfully answer about their boss, right? I mean, the fact that most people are highly suspicious of human resources comes first, right? Most people don't really trust that group. And so then you're asked to do this study to point out the problems with your boss, and you're told it's going to be kept confidential. I mean, how honest do you think these answers are really going to be, right? So this B scan thing was completely by self-reporting surveys or subordinate feedback. So, but in real life, the higher the rank, the greater the fear, jobs and reputation, right? So, respondents, I would say they would underreport destructive behavior, especially when the offender has power, influence, or charm. So, to me, that means I don't know. I've never conducted psychological research, but to me, it just seems kind of crazy, right? So So, and the research focuses on large corporations or executive level samples because that's where funding and access exist. But psychopathic traits don't stop at Fortune 500 walls. You have small business owners, local managers, landlords, pastors, or neighborhood power brokers can display the same exploitative patterns. Those environments rarely get studied. No HR department, no ethics boards, no research grants. So the corporate psychopath image is misleadingly upscale, if you ask me. So because this same behavior applies in small towns, family firms, public social service roles, just without the PR gloss, okay? And to get these things, the researchers depend on voluntary corporate participation. A company agrees to be studied only if it looks like leadership development. That filters out the worst offenders. The most abusive organizations simply won't let a psychologist in their front door. And the sample skews toward firms with some self awareness, not the sociopathic culture that needs studying the most. Because you have I call them the donut shop tyrant, the nonprofit manipulator, the small town official. They operate below the visibility threshold. So, yeah, I found it was the truly dangerous ones aren't in the spreadsheets. They're the ones no one dares to survey. And that's the donut shop owner, the mid level manager, the pillar of the community, small scale tyrants who never make it into peer reviewed papers because their victims can't speak safely. So the number we have likely floor estimates, not ceiling. So, yeah. Uh, so their work from the 1990s to 2010s combined three sources of data, but the mix leans heavily towards surveys and interviews, not long term ethnographic observation. So it's called the B Scale 360. It's a 113 item questionnaire derived from Robert Hare's PCLR adapted for business context. It was distributed inside cooperating companies, usually through HR departments or professional networks. Respondents rated themselves and their coworkers or supervisors on behaviors such as deceit, superficial charm, emotional shallowness, and manipulation. Many studies relied on peer or subordinate ratings, which creates the power imbalance issue that I've been talking about. People tend to underreport the boss's darker traits. So, in some projects, a subset of executives underwent blah blah blah. Yeah, well, I see a lot of problems with this study. So, um, I don't know. I don't know who would seriously take this study. And you got a high level job. HR comes along and says, "Hey, we're going to do a study. How about if we do this study and you answer it?" Yeah, I don't know. To me, this smells like a trap door, and certainly not worth another hour discussing it. But yeah, that's another study that they can figure you out with the corporations. One of Robert Hare's most famous quotes was, he says, if he wasn't studying psychopaths in prisons, he'd be studying them on Wall Street. Gee, why didn't you study them on Wall Street, huh? So anyway, so that whole B scale thing, HR departments want something structured to show due diligence against toxic leadership claims. Yeah, yeah, I think this whole B scan thing sounds like a kind of a toxic setup, if you ask me, but that's just my opinion. So, um, under the APA rules, a psychologist who markets a diagnostic label based on coworkers' surveys is treading very close to an ethics violation unless every report explicitly says this. This is not a clinical diagnosis, and the raters are clearly non expert. So, yeah, this 360 test has ethics things written all over it. Uh, According to the BPS Code of Ethics, psychologists should work within the limits of their knowledge, skills, training, and experience. They must not use methods that are not supported by sufficient evidence. So yeah, this B scan 360 fails both criteria. If used as a psychopathy screen, it isn't validated for general work. So yeah, things got lots of problems with it, right? So and also this International Test Commission, they test users, must ensure appropriate qualifications and competence and avoid interpretations that could unfairly affect individuals. Yeah, well, I mean, how do you ask somebody's secretary to tell you if the guy's a psychopath or not? Maybe the person's a good guesser, right? So a tool like the B-Scan 360 can be ethically used only as a general leadership risk or cultural survey, never as proof that someone is a psychopath. So what they did was they skirted the edge of those ethics rules for more than 20 years, not by directly violating them in print, but by forming their work in a way that sounds responsible while letting others infer these stronger claims. So they really got into trouble with this one. So Hare and Bobiak repeatedly use disclaimers like the B-Scan 360 is designed to help organizations identify and manage potential leadership risk. It is not a diagnostic instrument. Then a paragraph later, they call those same risks corporate psychopathy. So that move lets them keep the scientific authority of the word psychopathy while dodging the legal and ethical burden of diagnosis. So it's a form of implied diagnosis, and they deny it formally but encourage it informally. So, for example, in his book, Snakes in Suits, which came out in 2006, they tell readers not to label anyone a psychopath, then spend the next 200 pages describing how to spot one at work. That test is sold commercially through Bob Hare's group, Multi Health. Now, I think this health group changed ownerships in the last few years, but I'm just going with what I have here. So the test is sold commercially through Multi Health Systems, which markets it using language such as identify and manage the corporate psychopath. So once a tool enters a for-profit ecosystem, yeah. So um, Hare often claims he's protecting science from misuse, yet his name appears prominently in training workshops, certification programs, and promotional events where the psychopath label is the main draw. Hare has threatened critics who question the tool's validity, as with Scheme and Cook dispute, which further discourages open ethical debates. So while he follows the letter of the ethics codes, no explicit diagnostic claim, no coercive use, he breaks their spirit by allowing and profiting from widespread misrepresentation. In journal articles such as Behavioral Science and the Law, Babiak presents small corporate samples showing correlation between B scan scores and unethical behavior. Well, I don't know. I'm going to skip past some of this stuff. I think we get the point here, right? They came up with another way to make money, and it just seems like it's not going so well, right? Um, so let's talk a little bit about Jennifer Scheme and David Cook. They argue that Hare's PCLR and by extension his later spinoffs like the B scan confound criminal behavior with personality traits, inflating correlations with recidivism and giving the checklist a pseudo diagnostic authority it does not deserve. So, using a proprietary checklist for high stakes decisions like parole or hiring without independent replication violates professional transparency and fairness. So, of course, Hare threatened defamation action against all that. So that's how that all happened. Um, there's a lot more to this, but I'm not going to go through. I need to take a break here, so I'm going to put this on hold for right now. I'll be back on the other side. Okay, I am back. I recorded that first segment a couple of days ago. So in this segment, I'm going to wrap all this up. I'm going to be finalizing Cleckley's military history. I tracked down the bases that he was actually at, so I'm not speculating that Cleckley was part of the NATO deal. I'll be also confirming the Hare timeline, and also Robert Hare and Cleckley did communicate back and forth. Also, I was suspicious because Robert Hare came on board with this checklist business while Cleckley was still alive. And I suspect it may be due to the kind of activities that Cleckley had been involved in, that coma therapy business and all of that. So I think that transition maybe took place because, well, Cleckley's reputation wouldn't be looking so good, right? And also, I suspect that Cleckley was involved with MK7, but here again, records were all destroyed, so I can't confirm it. I will try to be very clear of what I can confirm and what I can't confirm. I've been working for a very long time on a project I'm calling the Stolen Children Project. You know, all of those orphan trained children, all the children around the world that have been stolen all these years. Well, come to find out, nobody has actually looked at them all in one place. And what I'm finding with these stolen children is trauma, lots of trauma. And I've been saying this for years. I believe that we are surrounded by a lot of trauma victims who don't even know that they're trauma victims. So let's get going on this section here. There's another character in this thing when I was talking about the Sam Vaknin and the John Rotson deal with Robert Hare. Well, there was a third party that I remembered, a man named James Fallon. And actually, this is why I always talk about timelines. When you run the timelines, it all starts to add up. Well, is James Fallon part of the deception here? Yeah, I thought he was a deceiver for ever since he first came on the scene. So let's take a look at these timelines. First, we had the 1990s to the 2000s. We had Sam Vaknin, you know, the Israeli guy, talking about narcissism. 2004 to 2011, we had John Ronson talking about making kind of like psychopaths into like a pop meme. And then, interestingly enough, who followed John Ronson? Well, James Fallon. 2010 to 2014, he is a neuroscience, and it looks to me like he was just doing a rebranding. So here's how it all laid out. It started in 2008. John Ronson began interviewing Robert Hare and various clinicians. 2009, Ronson starts traveling for the book, prisons, hospitals, Florida, Wales, and Canada. 2010, Ronson gives early talks hinting at his psychopath project. May of 2011, his book, The Psychopath Test, is officially published. This is a blast. The book goes everywhere. So from May to June 2011, the book becomes a bestseller. John Ronson appears on NPR, The Daily Show, BBC, print and podcast features. And let the public controversy begin. Late 2011, the Hare versus Ronson conflict becomes widely known in psychology circles. Well, so what happened around after Ronson? Actually, somebody new enters the picture, James Fallon. James Fallon has an interesting story. He started talking about this business back in 2005. He claimed that he discovered his unusual PET scan while reviewing brain images for a family study. And this is just personal knowledge, not public yet. In 2006 to 2010, Fallon mentions the discovery informally at conferences he's attending, but no major media presence yet. And then in June of 2010, Fallon appears in a documentary segment on BBC about neuroscience and aggression. Kind of a minor appearance, but that was the last he was seen on TV. And then the big reveal. 22 September 2011, Fallon publicly presents Confessions of a Pro-Social Psychopath at the World Science Festival in New York. This is his first major public disclosure. So what happened right before that? Well, excuse me, right after that, October to December 2011, Fallon appears in several interviews and podcasts discussing his scan. 2012, the Scientific American Mind publishes a feature on pro-social psychopaths referencing Fallon. So then Fallon's story begins spreading through neuroscience blogs and media. 2012, Fallon appears on NPR programs and radio shows discussing psychopathy and brain imaging. June of 2013, Smithsonian publishes the major article called The Neuroscientist who discovered he was a psychopath. This blows up his public profile tremendously. So then, of course, November 2013, he publishes the book, The Psychopath Inside. Cha-ching, cha-ching. This book cements Fallon as a scientist, psychopath, celebrity. And so then in 2014, Fallon goes on to appear in TED Talks, BBC documentaries, podcasts, high profile interviews. Kind of sounds like John Ronson, right? So Fallon becomes pretty popular, right? Well, let's take a look at these dates. John Ronson's book came out 12 May 2011. Fallon's first major public appearance, 22 September 2011. The gap between Ronson's explosion and Fallon's emergence is 133 days, 4 months and 10 days. In other words, Fallon enters the public scene immediately after Ronson's book hits and after Hare is publicly going back and forth with Ronson over whether he was involved or not. This overlap is extremely tight in my book. This is why I always say, look at those timelines. So Ronson and Hare kind of publicly get into it a little bit in May of 2011. Hare doesn't say anything during that whole period. Then who shows up next? Well, Fallon debuts the pro-social psychopath persona in September of 2011. I think Fallon becomes the replacement face for psychopathy science because Hare had every incentive to comment on Fallon, right? But he didn't say a word. Hare did not mention a word about what Fallon was going around and say it because, and these are just my opinions, okay? This is all subject to revision. You can add more to it. We can keep going on all this. But it appears to me that Fallon's narrative conveniently benefited Hare without needing to coordinate together because Fallon promoted psychopathy as a brain pattern. He presented psychopathy as partially genetic. He presented psychopathy as a dark thrill and also psychopathy as a personality profile people could identify with. So what it really did was increase the interest in psychopathy and actually made higher demand for Hare's books and work. So Fallon essentially made Hare's culture friendly without criticizing him, right? But here's the odd part that I found. I could not find anything that Robert Hare said about Fallon. Robert Hare has commented on every major psychopath story except for James Fallon. He commented on journalistic pieces he disliked. He argued with Ron Johnson. He defended the PCLR. He corrected researchers publicly. He went after those researchers scheme and cook and tried to sue them to silence him, but silence on Fallon. Why is that? Well, it had to be strategic, if you ask me. But, silence doesn't mean that they coordinated together, but it does prove my point that Robert Hare was acting deliberately by not talking about James Fallon. Why Hare staying quiet is the only part that defies normal academic behavior. Fallon said things like, I'm a psychopath, but I'm fine. He also said psychopathy is a brain pattern, not moral rot. Psychopaths can be successful. Hey, we're not all serial killers. We're like this because of genes. I'm a good psychopath, says Fallon. So Fallon pushed the psychopathy brain scan idea, which boosted the legitimacy of Hare's field, even though it was scientifically weak and overblown. Fallon's messaging helped normalize the idea that psychopathy is biological, that it is rooted in brain structure, that it is measurable, that it has specific traits, and also that psychopathy can be scanned, detected, and classified. Here again, this is another pattern. They always want to claim these things are genetic, right? Like blame the victim. Hey, if you've got cancer, it's because you got it from your mom or your dad. Hey, you're a psychopath? Hey, you got it from your parents. So they push this whole genetic thing, even though what Fallon was saying was not true. Hare stood silent. So it actually increased sales of books. So that's where the dates line up. The dates all line up. May 2011, Ronson comes out with his book. All that summer, Robert Hare says nothing. September 22nd, 2011, James Fallon explodes on the scene and becomes the new face of psychopathy. And Fallon's book blows up. It created the same kind of thing that it created with that Psychopath book that Hare did with Babiak about psychopaths as corporate snakes. People after Fallon started saying things like, well, maybe my uncle might be one. I wonder if I'm one. Hmm, maybe psychopathy is kind of fascinating. Huh, brains are cool. Love these TED Talks. Hey, let's have a laugh about it. And that humanized the term, reduces seriousness. And Fallon was probably exaggerating, probably misinterpreting his own brain scan, definitely dramatizing for media, and he was using his family as part of a crafted persona. And it feels theatrical. He claims that his wife and kid, they all accept that he's a psychopath. His kids realize, hey, dad's a psychopath, but not such a bad guy. And they realize that there are good psychopaths. And people also started saying things, well, I have the brain of a killer. These are entertainment tropes, not clinical realities. And here's what I want to get to the crux of the matter here. In all of the work I've been doing with all these abandoned children all over the world, trauma is key. Trauma specialists. I think what happened was this. I think trauma got, let me see how to say this. Trauma got folded in with psychopathy. Yes, trauma. So I believe, and I've been saying this for years now, we are surrounded by trauma victims, people who are traumatized that don't even know they were traumatized. And I believe what happened was this, they mixed the trauma people in with the psychopathy people. And that's exactly how, because if you claim that all of the trauma people are really psychopaths, then you'll have to follow me here for a second. Then you got a whole pool of trauma people that they can then classify as being psychopaths, right? And then you got the actual psychopaths, right? So what do? Well, you really muddy the water, right? You got all these trauma people mislabeled. You got all these see, you got this whole ball of confusion going on. And I believe it happened on purpose. But before you agree with me, let me share with you why I started thinking this way. There's a lot of trauma specialists and researchers, and they argue this, that trauma can flatten the affect. Trauma can reduce startle response. Trauma can produce emotional detachment. Childhood abuse creates callous, unemotional traits. Neglect of children mimics low empathy. Disassociation mimics psychopathic coldness. But to them, the model that we're looking at now, it pathologizes trauma survivors. It confuses symptoms of abuse with innate psychopathy. It ignores developmental origins. It encourages a born psychopath narrative. And it feeds mass labeling in prisons and foster care. Many trauma-focused clinicians explicitly warned against using the PCLR without a trauma lens. And there's one doctor, Dr. Colin Ross, who's done a tremendous amount of work about trauma. Many thousands of prisoners, mental patients, children, and unwitting civilians were used in mind control experiments. This was mainstream, not fringe. Top universities and major psychiatric leaders were involved. Research overlapped with biological, chemical, and radiation experiments. Deliberate creation of disassociation and multiple personality was a stated aim in several large projects. Children were among the targets. Hypnotic couriers and Manchurian type operatives were successfully tested. And through all of this, organized psychiatry has not honestly faced this history. There's been no serious accounting, no ethical reckoning, or systematic follow up for victims. Journals publish this work instead of condemning it. Then they have the secrecy and compartmentalization remains. Many documents were destroyed. Surviving files are heavily redacted. Front organizations hid the real funders. And Colin Ross, Dr. Ross, insists this work has to be seen in larger patterns. Mind control and behavior control research was systematic. It was funded by the CIA, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Public Health Service, and others. It was conducted at major universities and hospitals. There were related areas that overlap the radiation experiments, the biological and chemical warfare research, then the hypnosis and brainwashing studies. Dr. Dr. Ross Collin also emphasized leading psychiatrists and neurosurgeons were involved. Many of these experiments were actually published in medical journals. The professional climate was permissive and supportive of this research. Organized psychiatry has never clearly confronted or acknowledged this history. So, Ross states the goal to break the silence about the role of psychiatrists and medical schools in mind control programs, to show that what sounds like science fiction was, in fact, supported, funded, and normalized within the profession. And here's another interesting thing I found out: there is no major biography of Cleckley. No one has done an academic biography. There's no popular biography. There's no documentary. There's no major university archive dedicated to him. For a man whose concept reshaped forensic psychiatry, this is extraordinary. Compare that to Freud, Jung, Blücher, and even Hare. All of them have multiple biographers, critics, and scholarly treatments. Cleckley has almost nothing. The only substantial sources that even mention him are brief introductions in older editions of The Mask of Sanity, scattered obituaries, a few lines in textbooks. His life details are shockingly thin in the record. Most people, even professionals, only know that Cleckley lived in Georgia. He co wrote The Three Faces of Eve. He wrote The Mask of Sanity. He practiced at a large southern psychiatric hospital. But the deeper parts of his life are not discussed anywhere. His military consulting in the 1940s, his work with soldiers at Camp Fort Gordon, which I will be getting a lot more into, his involvement with experimental treatments like coma therapy, narcosis, and shock, his connections with early behavioral research, the institutional settings that directly overlapped with wartime intelligence. Cleckley had patients who served as the prototypes for psychopathy. All of that is missing from mainstream histories. The field looks like they quietly erased him because his methods, maybe they became too embarrassing. I don't really know. Because Cleckley's clinic used things like insulin comas. He prolonged drug sedation. He conducted shock therapies, narcoanalytical interviews. He also did deep sleep protocols. So, and then when psychiatry turned toward SSRIs and cognitive models, the field conveniently let Cleckley fade. I think Cleckley became a founding father they didn't want to claim because he connected them to invasive treatments, military wards, Cold War psychiatry, the old moralized language of conscience and sanity. Robert Hare modernized the field and became the acceptable face. Cleckley was quietly dropped. Universities that hold archives of major psychiatrists like Yale, Harvard, McGill, Zurich, Johns Hopkins have nothing significant for Cleckley. His papers are not curated. His correspondence is not digitized. His clinical case notes, which he used liberally in Mask of Sanity, have never been released. Compare that to Henry Murray, who was the OSS psychologist. Ewan Camerman was the MK Ultra guy in Canada. Carl Jung left volumes of letters. Emil Kraepelin left multiple archive collections. Cleckley is the only foundational figure in the 20th century psychiatry with that level of disappearance. I could not find anything. Maybe I didn't look hard enough. Maybe you know more. Let's all gather around and start talking about this stuff. So, the modern psychopath industry seems to treat him like a symbolic grandfather, not a real man. Every PCLR manual mentions him. Every psychopathy symptom includes a hat tip to Mask of Sanity. But nobody digs into his biography, his military connections, the hospital environment, the research influences, his collaborators, his funding sources, or his real patients. He is treated almost like a mythological origin point, not a historical figure. A handful of scholars, fewer than 6, have noted this strange absence that Cleckley has no biography, that Mask of Sanity is widely cited but never researched, that no one knows where his case files are, that psychiatry refuses to confront how foundational his wartime work was. But even these acknowledgments are tiny asides buried in academic journals with almost no readerships. No one has written the story. Meanwhile, Robert Hare became the face and the industry followed. Robert Hare published papers, did interviews, starred in documentaries, testified in court, and created a massive proprietary empire. Cleckley? Well, forget, except as a name on the front page of a manual. And because Robert Hare's system became proprietary and litigious, the field stopped doing foundational historical work that might raise uncomfortable questions, especially about the deep roots in military psychiatry, wartime screening programs, and the development of behavioral control methods. Cleckley's life to me appears to be the missing piece. He seemed to have written him out of it. I think Cleckley has been effectively memory holed, not in a dramatic conspiratorial way, but in a quiet, bureaucratic way. He is the founding father of modern psychopathy, yet he has none of these things going for him. For nearly 80 years, the entire field has built on his concept without ever examining the man who created it. This absence is not normal, it's very telling. I think what happened was the field wanted his concept, but not his history. Cleckley gave psychiatry the definition of psychopathy, but his actual life and methods were ugly by today's standards. Coma therapy, shock therapy, deep sleep narcosis, hypnosis drug interviews. wartime military wards, selection and screening of soldiers. If the modern field highlighted these facts, it would damage the legitimacy of everything that came after. So I think that's why they kept the idea but buried the man. The field desperately wants psychopathy to look like a clean, quantitative science. Cleckley's world was not clean. It was moralistic, narrative, intuitive, pre DSM, pre neuroscience, and it was soaked in wartime psychiatry. It threatens the myth of scientific objectivity. Cleckley worked with soldiers during World War II. He evaluated men who were deserters, unreliable, emotionally flat, impulsively violent. This work fed directly into Cold War behavior programs. It's easier if Cleckley remains a vague historical name. So that's why Hare became the acceptable face of the field. Hare was safe because he was Canadian, he was academic, he was into statistical things, he was modern, quantitative, and media friendly. He made psychopathy sound like a measurement instead of a moral idea. If the field embraced Cleckley too loudly, people would notice his roots in wartime treatment wards, invasive therapies, proto behavioral interrogation, moral language, and pre scientific psychiatry. So they needed to put Hare in over while Cleckley was still alive. I think it was just a matter of trying to survive, right? So and this is the most important part. By the 1990s to the 2000s, psychopathy was a prison tool, a court tool, a risk assessment tool, a training industry, a consulting business, a publishing revenue stream. If people look too closely at Cleckley's work, it would raise questions like where did these ideas actually come from? Why were soldiers his core cases? What treatments were used on them? Which institutions funded the research environment? So academics don't need to meet in a room and decide to erase someone. They erase them by not assigning their texts, by not funding dissertations, by not writing biographies, by not archiving papers, by not teaching their history, and by not citing them. Silence is a collective action, but it requires no coordination. Cleckley was not erased because a shadowy group met in secret. He was erased because his methods could prove embarrassing, because his settings were in the military. His treatments were beyond cruel and brutal. His work overlapped too closely with early behavioral control research. Cleckley's concept was enormously useful, but his biography was inconvenient. The psychiatry industry benefited from a sanitized origin story. This is how powerful systems bury their own origins. So, and here's where we start to get into some controversies. They claim, and I've done shows about this, that they have learned to split the personalities of people by inflicting severe sexual trauma on them. It may be this may be it. I thought that maybe by splitting the personality through abusive sexual trauma, they were able to create psychopaths. But here's what it probably is more in tune with. Probably severe sexual abuse does not create psychopaths in the clinical sense, but it does create disassociation, emotional numbing, and identity splitting that can look like psychopathy. And that distinction is the entire key to the historical puzzle. Because the moment you understand that, you suddenly see why Cleckley's work, the disassociation tradition, the split mind experiments, the military programs, and modern risk systems, they all align without needing a smoking gun document. First, most of the 20th century, psychiatry treated the human mind like an object that could be broken open, rearranged, and reassembled, a machine that responded to pressure, trauma, suggestion, and fear. Cleckley's clinic was part of that world. Cameron's hospital was part of that world in Canada. The old Army psychiatric wards were part of that world. The vocabulary was polite, dressed in white coats and Latin roots, but the core idea was simple. Trauma fractures the mind. Sometimes it shatters. Sometimes it splits into separate chambers, each holding a piece of the original person. Sometimes it dulls the emotional centers until feeling simply drains away. Cleckley never said this openly, but everything he writes points to it. In his book about Eve, Eve wasn't just a strange clinical curiosity. She was a map of what happens when the psyche splits under pressure. The shock ward wasn't just a treatment center, it was a crucible where identity was first broken and then reshaped. The veterans and soldiers that Cleckley studied weren't simply misbehaving men. Many had endured experiences no nervous system can metabolize without either collapsing or sealing itself shut. Likely he knew all this, and yet he crafted the most influential portrait of the emotionless human as if it were inherently deficit, a missing moral organ, rather than what trauma science would eventually reveal. A learned shutdown response, a dissociative survival mode, a splitting of self to stay alive. So, extreme sexual abuse doesn't create psychopaths, but here's where it does create, and what every survivor and trauma clinician knows, it creates numbing, detachment, emotional shutdown, compartmentalization, identity fragmentation, inability to feel empathy because feeling itself becomes unbearable, masking to survive, hyper control or total disconnect. To the untrained eye or to someone looking through Cleckley's moral lens, this can look like psychopathy. To a military psychiatrist in the 1940s, it could be mistaken for character defect. To a prison evaluator in the 1980s using Hare's PCLR, it could score like affective coldness, but it's not psychopathy. It's trauma wearing armor. It's protection being mistaken for pathology. It's disassociation being mislabeled as danger. And this is the real horror in the history record. Not an experiment gone rogue, but a diagnostic lens that turned trauma survivors into predators on paper. Let me repeat that. This was not an experiment gone rogue, but a diagnostic lens that turned trauma survivors into predators on paper. Cleckley's split mind work with Eve revealed how trauma divides the self. His shock therapies revealed how the mind collapses under pressure. His war psychiatry revealed how the nervous system retreats when pushed beyond endurance. But he treated all of this as evidence of a fixed moral defect. And then Robert Hare came along and turned that model into a scoring system. Courts then turned the scoring system into sentencing policy. NATO turned emotional stability into security concept. Modern algorithm turned it into behavioral prediction. And not once, not in 80 years, did the system admit the possibility that what they were labeling psychopathy was often trauma rewritten as deviance. Not once in 80 years. Did you hear that clearly? So that's why the link to MK7 matters even without documents, because these programs, whatever their code names, were built on the same premise that Cleckley worked with, that the mind can be split, controlled, or hollowed out by design, and that a split mind is manageable, predictable, useful. It's no coincidence that trauma induced disassociation from abuse and induced disassociation from conditioning or drugs or coercion produces similar emotional signatures. The system didn't need to create psychopaths, it needed to create predictable, emotionally numbed human beings. People who could function without feeling, or follow orders without hesitation, or endure treatment without protest. And when the same emotional scars show up in abused children today, in the numbness, the disconnect, the flat affect, the system still confuses survival patterns with psychopathic traits. You'll never get a box labeled MK7 creating psychopaths, but what you will get is 80 years of psychiatry misreading trauma as deficit and building policy around the misreading. Trauma can look like psychopathy when you've never seen real safety. When a child is hurt, especially sexually, the nervous system does something very old and very smart. It shuts off. Not because the child lacks empathy, but because empathy would kill them. They freeze. They disassociate. They shut down. They observe instead of participate. They smile without feeling it. They read the room but stay outside the emotion. Their face stops showing distress because distress gets ignored or punished. So from the outside, you see a flat affect. You see a lack of fear. You see a lack of emotional response. You see unusual calmness, detachment, ability to mimic feelings. An adult who seems self contained to the point of being icy. To a traumatized child, that is survival. To a badly trained psychologist, it gets misread as psychopathic affect. One of the cruelest ironies is this: the child who had a conscience so overwhelmed that it shut down temporarily may grow up and be labeled as someone who never had one. Children don't start out cold. They become cold when the world stays cold to them. Children grow hardened. They reach out. No one responds. They resort into a shell to survive. A child doesn't numb on purpose. They numb because every other option hurts too much. When a child cries and no one comes, the brain turns the volume down. When they ask for help and are ignored, the brain stops asking. When they tell the truth and are punished, the brain stops telling. When they feel terror and can't escape, the brain stops feeling. Over time, the emotional system becomes something like scar tissue, functional, protective, but not soft. That numbness looks like coldness, but it isn't emptiness. It is too much feeling forced offline. This is not psychopathy, it's trauma. Trauma can create the appearance of psychopathy, but the core is the exact opposite. A true psychopath lacks guilt, empathy, emotional depth, capacity to form real bonds, internal distress about harming others. A trauma survivor who looks cold has empathy buried under layers of protection, a longing for connection that got punished, emotional depth that become unbearable, guilt, often too much of it, a sense of danger that never shuts off. One is born without emotional wiring, the other shut the wiring off and after buried them alive. They are not the same, but how far away they can look similar. When what a healthy brain does when the world has become unsafe for too long. People who endured severe childhood sexual abuse often develop emotional numbing, an almost eerie calm, hyper observational, a sense of watching yourself from outside, difficult feeling fear or sadness the way others do, a cool exterior that hides chaos inside, a self that splits off to protect the core of who you are. These are not signs of moral defect. These are signs of survival. If anything, the ability to stay alive, stay functioning, stay thinking when the nervous system was pushed beyond its limits is the opposite of psychopathy. It's resilience in the face of something that should never have happened. So the real tragedy is this: the system uses Cleckley's model to punish the very people trauma created. Cleckley thought emotional flatness meant no conscience. Robert Hare turned it into a score. Courts turned the score into a sentence. But none of them stopped to ask what caused the coldness? What caused the shutdown? What caused the split? Because if they had asked, they'd have to admit a large portion of people labeled dangerous are wounded children first. Many prisoners scored as psychopathic have trauma histories far more severe than the average public realizes. Disassociative survivors, especially of sexual trauma, often score high on affect and remorselessness or emotional poverty, not because they are dangerous, but because they are numb. If the system admitted this, the entire structure of psychopathy research would collapse. The system is set up to misread trauma. A child who learned to go numb to survive may look emotionless, but numbness isn't lack, it's pain pushed out of sight. A real psychopath feels nothing. A trauma survivor feels too much, and the body locks it away to keep you alive. That's not a disorder, that's a defense. So every day, Cleckley saw all of this in state hospital wards. Women were admitted for hysteria who were really survivors. Soldiers with dissociative collapse. Young men with behavioral problems that were really trauma responses. Children at Georgia institutions who were abused long before admission. Women in the Eve case whose trauma was dramatized but never acknowledged. If you reread The Mask of Sanity with a trauma lens, it admits to sudden rages, emotional flattening, compartmentalized identity, detachment, self destructive acts, inability to trust, shallow emotions, intense shame, bizarre sexual behavior, fear of abandonment disguised as indifference. All of these are classic trauma symptoms, especially childhood sexual trauma. Cleckley avoids discussing sexual abuse directly, but survivor clinicians today can see it in his descriptions instantly. His patients weren't emotionally defective, they were traumatized. Maybe he didn't have the language. Cleckley's training and era forbade him from naming sexual trauma. In Cleckley's world, child sex abuse did not exist yet. Incest was almost never documented. Rape victims were labeled hysterical. Disassociation was seen as moral weakness. Trauma as a field did not exist until the 1980s. I didn't say the 1890s, I said the 1980s. So they didn't even talk about trauma until the 1980s. Gee, pretty amazing, huh? Freud's original trauma theory had been discredited and buried by psychiatry. So Cleckley could not write that this behavior comes from early sexual abuse, even if he knew he couldn't say it. So he wrote around it. The Eve case shows Cleckley absolutely understood sexual trauma, but he coded it. In the three phases of Eve, the real woman, Chris Sizemore, later revealed she was sexually abused. She witnessed horrific accidents. She lived in constant fear and disassociation. Cleckley and his co-author Thigpen never published that. They turned the story into a spectacle of multiple personality without naming the root. Why? Well, because in the 1950s, psychiatrists avoided sexual trauma narratives. Pushing it could ruin a clinician. Admitting abuse happened inside families was taboo. Disassociation was seen as a deficit, not a defense. So again, he coded the trauma rather than naming it. Did he know? Or maybe he simply couldn't say it. His patients were full of sexual chaos, self destructiveness, and disassociations were not psychopathy, they were trauma signals. Cleckley described them as compulsively promiscuity, old, odd sexual displays, inappropriate emotional responses, lack of bonding, impulsivity led to shame, tied to shame. These are trauma markers, not psychopathic traits. He misinterpreted the survival mechanisms of wounded people as evidence of a broken conscience. This misunderstanding is the foundation of his entire book. If MK7 or any trauma based research existed around him, he didn't need the files to see its effects. Because MK Ultra and related programs were about disassociation, identity fragmentation, emotional shutdown, obedience, and trauma induced attachment. Cleckley saw the results in the real world, even if he formally wasn't part of the program. He didn't need to conduct secret experiments, he inherited the reality on the wards. And they claim he lacked the trauma language, and then he interpreted the trauma as a personality deficit. His entire life's work is built on observing trauma without naming it, studying disassociation, cataloging emotional numbing, analyzing split cells, working with a real woman who became the three faces of Eve, using hypnosis, narcosis, and deep sedation, observing identity fragmentation, writing about personality that looks intact but internally fractured. Cleckley's clinic had all the ingredients that later intelligence programs became obsessed with. So, Cleckley's shock based methods weren't mind control, they were part of the era's very crude psychiatry toolbox. In the 1940s to 50s, psychiatry used electroshock, deep sedation, insulin comas, hypnotic drugs, narcoanalytics, sensory flooding, emotional overwhelm, not because of secret agendas, but because these were the mainstream treatments for depression, trauma, hysteria, psychosis, and shell shock. Cleckley wasn't inventing programs, he was following the standard medical recipes of his time. Those methods look brutal today, and they were, but they were not covert. They were medicine as it was understood then. Intelligence programs later became interested in some of these same phenomena, but for totally different reasons. The intelligence world became interested in disassociation, amnesia, emotional shutdown, suggestibility, shock, splitting of attention, altered states. But their goals were not the same as Cleckley's. The overlap is topic. So Cleckley was fascinated by disassociation because he saw it in traumatized people. Later, intelligence programs became fascinated by disassociation for their reasons. So, I don't know. The records are all burned, buried. Who knows? I think they probably worked together and figured this all out. I don't think it was just oddly happened out of the blue. Um, Cleckley described two totally different psychological states using the same language. So yeah, he the disassociation and the trauma reaction along with the psychopathy are almost the exact same things. For the disassociation and the trauma, he called it emotional shutdown, flat affect, compartmentalized self, numbing, avoidance, self-protection, identity splitting. And for the psychopathy, it was lack of empathy, lack of guilt, lack of bonding, predatory behavior, manipulation, shallow emotion. But they're not the same thing. And Cleckley placed them in the same bucket. And once he did that, the entire field became confusing trauma with moral defect. Because supposedly trauma science did not exist when Cleckley was doing his writing. When Cleckley was forming his ideas, child abuse wasn't acknowledged. Sexual trauma was unspoken. Disassociation wasn't understood. PTSD didn't exist as a diagnosis. Attachment theory wasn't developed. Developmental trauma wasn't even recognized. He saw emotional numbness and couldn't interpret it as trauma. He interpreted it as character disorder, congenital defect, and moral emptiness. That mistake created 80 years of diagnostic confusion still going on today. Cleckley wrote obsessively about split selves, emotional flatness, and all that. What he didn't know that they were trauma adaptations, or I could argue that he did know. Maybe Cleckley knew all this trauma stuff early on. I think that's more likely the case than anything that Cleckley really knew. Because this diagnostic fog allowed trauma survivors to be mislabeled as dangerous people to be excused as trauma victims. Courts came to confuse numbness with predators. Clinicians became confused survival strategies with personality defects. Entire groups, adoptees, foster kids, abuse survivors get to be labeled disordered. The public the public to misunderstand what a psychopath even is. Yeah, so when everything looks like psychopathy, nothing actually is. When the definition is fuzzy, survivors are pathologized. Real psychopaths hide in the noise. The justice system gets it wrong. Clinicians misread trauma as manipulation. Traumatized adults get labeled borderline or antisocial. Adopted children get stamped for life. Emotional numbness gets mistaken for evil. And yes, the psychiatrists end up looking like the only sane ones because they are the ones defining the terms. It's structural power. The definers always look sane. The definers always look defective. Cleckley failed to understand trauma, but the ripple effect became enormous because then Hare built his checklist on Cleckley. NATO and Cold War psychology built threat assessments on Robert Hare. Courts built sentencing policy based on that checklist. Modern psychiatry built personality theory on outdated categories. Entire populations of traumatized children were mislabeled. They claim it's because of ignorance. Well, I don't think that's right at all. Because once the root is wrong, everything grown from it is distorted. Now the system can't tell the difference between a child who went numb to survive and a person who feels nothing because they never had empathy. Cleckley mixed those categories. Hare classified them. Institutions adopt them. And now trauma survivors can look psychopathic on paper simply because they shut down to protect themselves. That's not confusion. That's a structural failure that has gone unchallenged for over 80 years. Disassociation and moral defect were blended into the same vocabulary, and once that happened, nobody could tell who was which. A world where trauma survivors look psychopathic and actual psychopaths can hide in the noise is how this ended up. Exactly how it ended up. Cleckley lived in a world where trauma was invisible. Children weren't believed. Incest was taboo. Rape wasn't discussed. Attachment science didn't exist. PTSD didn't exist. Disassociation was treated as hysteria. So when he saw emotional flatness, compartmentalization, lack of fear, sudden shifts in personality, masking, people who smiled without feeling, calmness in chaos, confusion around identity, sexualized behaviors, numb detachment. He was seeing trauma, but interpreted it as a personality defect. So he poured every form of emotional absence into the same bucket. Once these two categories are mixed in the foundation, nothing built afterwards is clean. Psychopathy is basically absence of empathy from birth. Trauma is too much emotion buried for survival. When Cleckley blended trauma and psychopathy into one category, courts could no longer tell who was dangerous. Prisons misread trauma survivors as remorsefulness. Adoptees and foster children were labeled borderline. Trauma responses were pathologized. Sexual trauma survivors looked emotionally cold. Disassociation was confused with manipulation. Identity fragmentation was confused with deceitfulness. This created exactly the blob of chaos that I've been talking about. A world where trauma is mistaken for evil. Evil is mistaken for trauma. Survivors get punished. Predators get misdiagnosed. Clinicians act like the only sane ones, and the public loses all clarity. Yeah, well, you're going to have to decide for yourself. Um, because then in the 50s to the 70s, it multiplied the confusion. When an institution doesn't understand trauma, everything looks like madness. Imagine an era where disassociation was seen as manipulation, emotional numbness was seen as pathology, shock therapies were normal, sexual trauma wasn't recognized, children with attachment disorders were labeled disturbed, adoptees were diagnosed with personality disorders, women were blamed for their own symptoms, trauma victims were told they were borderline. This wasn't just an evil plan, it was structural blindness. But the structural blindness produces the same outcome as deliberate distortion, confusion about who is actually psychopathic and who is a survivor. So I didn't mention it. I think I mentioned it down below here, but what's going on with adopted children? Adopted children typically get labeled as borderline personality. If it was bad enough not knowing who your family of origin is, then you get a mental diagnosis. So if you were adopted and you're having any issues, not because you were adopted, but because you're probably secretly crazy, right? What they do is they tag you with a mental illness. So for the rest of your life, when you go to apply for any security jobs, you get to tick that box that says, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental disorder? You got to check yes, okay? So that is a further traumatization of these poor adopted children. So, um, because if we don't understand trauma, we can't understand psychopathy. Without trauma science, the entire concept collapses into confusion. So I guess we have to look at it. Was this confusion on purpose or not? Because none of this was acknowledged during Cleckley's time. I'm going to put this on hold for a bit here. Okay, I am back. I am determined to wrap up this show. Should be about 30 minutes and we'll be all done. So, where does this end us? Well, it ends us being that we end up having people so confused, judges cannot tell the difference now between a traumatized person who went numb and a psychopathic person who was just born numb. So the system behaved as if numbness equals danger. The result being trauma survivors got longer sentences. Emotional shutdown was treated as lack of remorse. Calmness in court was used as evidence of psychopathy. Disassociation was interpreted as manipulation. Pure diagnostic chaos, all rooted in Cleckley's misunderstanding, or I would have to argue, possibly on purpose. So, psychiatry lost the ability to distinguish between trauma and psychopathy. Also, got a lot going on with this borderline business and all of that, right? So, the field can't reliably tell apart trauma induced emotional numbing from true psychopathic emotional absence. This is also the number one criticism of the psychopathic field by modern trauma researchers. There was a study called the ACE studies, 1990s to the 2000s. It was called the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE research. And would that show us? Well, the more childhood trauma a person has, the more likely they display the exact traits Cleckley labeled as psychopathy: impulsivity, risk taking, shutdown, emotional numbness, calmness and chaos, emotional distance, difficulty bonding. All of these map perfectly onto high ACE scores. This also destroys the idea that Cleckley's traits were inborn. All that genetic business out the window. They do know they have been able to do some brain imaging on trauma, unlike what that Fallon guy was cooking up with his false PET scans. They know that modern brain imaging shows trauma literally changes the I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time pronouncing today. The prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the emotional circuits. These changes produce low fear response, emotional blunting, reduced guilt feelings, and disassociation. Cleckley attributed all of these to psychopathy. So, studies on adopted and foster children from 1990s to present, the most damning evidence. Adopted trauma survivors often score high on psychopathic tests for antisocial trait scales or borderline measures, not because they are disordered, but because emotional shutdown is a trauma adaptation. This shows that the psychopathy traits Cleckley described can be produced environmentally. This completely disproves the foundation or the gene theory. Most people who are labeled borderline are actually showing trauma responses that psychiatry didn't understand when the diagnosis was invented. That's the root of it all. Borderline personality disorder, or BPD, was created in 1968 and officially codified in the DSM-3 in 1980, decades before trauma science existed and before PTSD had even been formally defined. So clinicians were looking at trauma survivors who showed abnormal terror, emotional volatility, self harm, relationship chaos, intense attachment swings, frantic attempts to stay connected, sudden detachment, identity confusion, disassociation, unstable sense of self. These are classic trauma symptoms, but at the time they had no name, so psychiatry called this cluster borderline. The label became permanent, the people became difficult, and the trauma part became invisible. So, borderline became the wastebasket diagnosis for abused women, adopted children, and foster youth. This sounds harsh, but even the psychiatric textbooks admit it. BPD or borderline became the diagnosis people received when the story was complicated. The trauma was severe. The clinicians didn't know what to do. The patient didn't respond to basic therapy. The system didn't want to fund long-term care trauma. It became a shorthand for this person is hurting and chaotic, and we don't know how to help. Statistics show that up to 80 to 90% of people with a BPD diagnosis have severe childhood trauma. As many as 70% were abused or neglected. Adopted and foster children are diagnosed at massively higher rates than the general population. Women are labeled borderline far more often than men. Disassociation gets misread as borderline instability. Self harm gets misread as manipulation. So trauma survivors get labeled borderline because the system tags the symptoms, but ignores the cause. Adoption always begins with loss, even if the adoptive family is loving. Babies and children who experience separation, institutional care, early neglect, inconsistent caregiving, moves between homes, disruptions, trauma before adoption, develop attachment systems shaped by survival, not safety. So later in life, they may show fear of abandonment, emotional insensitivity, trust problems, disassociation, identity confusion, self harm, hypervigilance. Instead of saying, this child has trauma from early separation, the system says, this child is borderline, proving that the more trauma you have, the more your behavior resembles borderline criteria, even though your personality is still intact. And then we have complex PTSD, finally recognizes the long term effect of chronic childhood trauma. Many clinicians now believe what psychiatry called borderline is really complex PTSD plus attachment injury. And many trauma experts argue the borderline diagnosis should be retired. I have a whole list of these people down below. I'll pick out a couple of them. The first one, Andrew Scull. He's a historian of psychiatry. He talks about this early psychiatry misinterpreted trauma as character defect. He places Cleckley firmly within this pre trauma era where the entire field misunderstood abuse and disassociation. And his position is this: many psychopathic behaviors were actually trauma symptoms misunderstood by an old psychiatric worldview. Another person, Joel Braslow, he wrote a book, Mental Ills and Bodily Cures. He documented how mid century psychiatrists, including Cleckley's generation, treated trauma, disassociation, and emotional numbness as personality flaws, moral defects, or psychopathic tendencies. And he explicitly connects childhood trauma, wartime trauma, institutional abuse with the behaviors that doctors later called psychopathy. He shows Cleckley's era treated trauma with deep sleep therapy, narcosis, shock, and behavior modification. This context explains why Cleckley couldn't see trauma. He was part of a system that caused trauma while denying it exists. So, yes, another person, Mikkel Jacobson, a book Making Minds and Madness. And he argues that many psychopath diagnoses were really institutional artifacts, labels that covered up trauma histories the clinics refused to acknowledge. He's one of the few historians who directly critiques the Cleckley to Hare lineage, saying it's built on anecdotal speculation and moral interpretation, not science. He doesn't say Cleckley was sinister, but that the diagnosis itself was a misunderstanding of trauma. Well, I think it's a mix of things. I think we have all these traumatized people all over the place, and when I come back with a show about the Department of Defense, you're going to be ready to get on your heels over that one. The Department of Defense runs the most and biggest child care operations in the entire world, and talk about loaded with issues, but not time for today. So, yes, we're loaded with people with trauma, and I believe that they wanted to hide their diagnosis to blame it on the people themselves, right? If you could ignore the trauma and call them all a bunch of psychopaths, well, who gets off the hook? Well, the actual psychopaths is how I see it. So, anyway, so these people have done some very good work looking into all this. There's a person called Jonathan Metzi. He's a historian of psychiatry. He wrote a book, The Protest Psychosis Against Health, and he shows that psychiatric diagnoses get twisted by racism, sexism, moral judgment, and institutional need. Everything he writes about schizophrenia in the 1960s applies directly to psychopathy. The diagnosis reflect cultural fears, not human reality. His work supports the view that psychiatry labeled trauma survivors are disordered at the same time while they're protecting institutional power. You need to hear me very clearly. I am not saying this makes less psychopaths in charge. I'm saying by labeling everybody else that has trauma as being psychopaths, it certainly blurs the whole idea, right? It would make the real psychopaths much, much harder to pick out of the madness. So, this person, Vanderkolk, a psychiatrist, wrote a book, The Body Keeps a Score. He shows that trauma causes emotional numbness, trauma causes emotional deregulation, all traits that Cleckley and Hare called psychopathic. So there's just so much confusion. And um, one other one I'll talk about is Colin Ross. I mentioned him earlier. He has a book called The Trauma Model. He also has a book called The CIA Doctors. Very interesting man. I encourage you to listen to some of his interviews. He argues that disassociation is the most misunderstood symptom in psychiatry, that disassociation was historically treated as psychopathy or moral weakness. So, yeah, you don't have to agree with what he says, but he's one of the few, the very few, who connects trauma, disassociation, misdiagnosis, and psychopathy confusion. So, pretty high numbers, right? 80 to 90% of people with BPD have severe childhood trauma. That is really crazy, crazy stuff. Excuse me. Okay, so let's get to Cleckley. I didn't just want to offhandedly say that Cleckley was actually military, so I went and dug through his entire history. Took a lot of work, took a lot of work, but here's where Cleckley was operating out of. In 1941 to 1945, you'll notice right before the U.S. entered World War II, Cleckley was at Camp Gordon in the war years. Camp Gordon in Augusta, Georgia, opens as a major U.S. Army training base with its own station hospital. Cleckley became the psychiatric consultant to that hospital, reporting through the Army Medical Department to the Surgeon General's office. At the same time, the OSS, which was prior to the CIA, which was the Office of Strategic Services, forms in 1942 and creates Station S for psychological selection under Henry A. Murray. Cleckley's work evaluating superficially normal but unreliable soldiers occurs in the same bureaucratic network feeding personnel data to the Surgeon General and the OSS. So, yes, I am 100%, I'll die on this hill. Cleckley was military because from 1946 to 1949, it went from the OSS to the CIA and NATO. The OSS dissolved in 1945, and that was replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, in 1946 to 47. Also, as a little interesting note, the CIA is only allegedly supposed to operate outside of the USA. Well, they were supposed to only operate for a short period, but here we are, right? Well, when they're located here in the United States, they're usually under the label of the NSA. So if you hear of somebody that works within the NSA, they likely work the CIA kind of stuff, but within the United States. I hope that I didn't confuse the matter. Okay, so then the UK USA in 1946 formalized this thing called the Five Eyes. Then NATO over there in Belgium was founded in 1949, and it adopts these shared standards for personnel vetting, psychological screening, and intelligence cooperation. So, Cleckley was still continuing revising the Mask of Sanity around 1948, and he was now firmly embedded in U.S. medical psychiatry. So, the 1950s to the 70s, institutionalization of psychopathy research. Fort Gordon, where I found Cleckley, renamed in 1956, became the Signal Corps Training Center, and then later the Army Cyber Command, linking the same base to communications and intelligence infrastructure. Cleckley and Thigpen co-authored The Three Faces of Eve in 1957, continuing his clinical work with veterans and hospital patients. Psychiatric concepts of psychopathy began circulating in forensic and security research. And then we have enter Dr. Hare, 1970 to 1990s. Dr. Hare has only indicated that he attended a NATO meeting. Now, I think I know the NATO meeting he attended, and I'll get to that in a second. So, where did Cleckley come from? Well, he was a Rhodes Scholar. He studied at Oxford University. Let me see, he served at the Medical College of Georgia, Augusta, Georgia, internships, university hospitals. So here he first came under supervision of faculty in clinical medicine and psychiatry. Yes, his main career, 1930s to the 40s, he was over in Georgia. So, yeah. So then during the war era, World War II era, the U.S. Army Hospital, Fort Gordon near Augusta, that's where he was. He was a psychiatric consultant from 1942 to 45. Cleckley reported to the U.S. Army Medical Department through the local hospital's commanding officer. Camp Gordon was a large training base. His position connected him directly to military psychiatric evaluation, especially screening and treatment of servicemen for personality disorders or war neurosis. This period overlapped with his continued academic post at the Medical College of Georgia, meaning he effectively held dual civilian and military roles. So that's important because otherwise, part of his history, you might not catch that part, right? They may just say, oh, he was at that hospital in Georgia. Well, no, he was doing two things at the same time. So Cleckley's reporting hierarchy was academic and military medical. So his clinical cases came from hospital wards and veteran military patients, which helps explain why the Mask of Sanity in 1941 and later editions are filled with institutional case histories. a hybrid between state hospital psychiatry and military medicine. Cleckley's mask of sanity didn't come out of abstract theory. Came straight from military and veterans wards in Augusta, Georgia. His psychopaths weren't just random case studies. Many were servicemen, deserters, or veterans passing through state or military hospitals during and after the war years. Most of the patients Cleckley describes were institutionalized men, many with disciplinary or antisocial histories. In the 1930s to 40s America, those cases overwhelmingly came from VA hospitals or Army affiliated facilities. Cleckley's own institution, the Medical College of Georgia, also maintained a VA hospital partnership. Camp Gordon's U.S. Army Hospital, where Cleckley consulted, sent patients for psychiatric evaluations and follow ups to his university clinic. So you see, it gets really kind of messy, right? Took me quite a while to pull apart this whole stuff. Um, so by the late 1930s, the U.S. military was already screening recruits for mental deficiency, instability, and psychopathic personality. Cleckley's Mask of Sanity appeared in 1941, exactly as the Army and Selective Service systems were expanding. His book directly addresses the problem of hidden psychopathy among apparently normal men, precisely the type of undetected risk the Army feared in officers, agents, and intelligence roles. Cleckley's emphasis on surface normality masking emotional emptiness mirrors the concerns of wartime psychiatry. Could soldiers, spies, or officers appear stable yet be incapable of loyalty or empathy? Could they pass selective interviews and still endanger missions or comrades? His text reads almost like an early behavioral security manual, even though it's framed as clinical psychiatry. So by 1942, when the OSS, the pre CIA was formed, Cleckley was already the Army Hospital's psychiatric consultant at Camp Gordon. That placed him in the same bureaucratic ecosystem as other psychiatrists feeding data to the U.S. Army Surgeon General Office, which coordinated with the OSS Station S, the unit that ran psychological selection for spies. But there's no document that proves that Cleckley reported to the OSS, but his patients, setting, and timing align perfectly with that military psychiatric pipeline. In other words, Cleckley's Mask of Sanity is not just a clinical milestone, it's a product of early U.S. military psychiatry shaped by the personnel crisis and screening needs of the World War II buildup. By locating his psychiatric consulting role at Camp Gordon, which later became Fort Gordon, Cleckley wasn't just attached to a generic Army hospital. He was tied into a base that would grow into a hub of signals, intelligence, and operations. Camp Gordon was activated in 1941 as a major training post near Augusta, Georgia. The base included a station hospital, known historically as Camp Gordon Station Hospital, later evolving into Dwight D. Eisenhower Army Medical Center on Fort Gordon. And you can see why it got complicated because whenever they make these name changes, it just makes it a little harder to kind of follow the trail. So, in the post war and Cold War eras, Fort Gordon became a major signal and cyber communication center. Today, it hosts the U.S. Army Cyber Command, Signal Corps schools, and the NSA. Did you hear the NSA? Georgia Cryptology Center operations. So the base that once housed military wards and psychiatric services would become a nerve center of communications and intelligence. Cleckley's presence at the medical site thus puts him physically and institutionally in proximity to the later transformation of Fort Gordon into a signal, cyber, and intelligence hub. So let's talk about this group that Robert Hare talked about. Now, I'm not 100%. This is the exact group that because Robert Hare only speaks about a NATO conference. He doesn't say which NATO conference. So I had to do a lot of digging, and I'm going to be speculating because I do not have his name on any official paperwork. So, from 1949 to the present, NATO has evolved from a defensive treaty into a sprawling transnational bureaucracy. Its growth mirrors the privatization of psychological authority seen in the Cleckley Hare lineage. Both substituted narrative control for transparency. Both Cleckley and Hare define psychopathy. NATO defines security. NATO's story, when stripped of ceremony, is one of extraordinary reach and persistent opacity. From Brussels boardrooms to Balkan bases, from procurement offices to air corridors shadowing heroin routes, the alliance functions as both shield and conduit. Its visible mission is deterrence. Its hidden architecture is control. That's what makes the behavioral science connection so surprising. The idea that an organization known for tanks and treaties also sponsored quiet research into personality, aggression, and psychopathy sounds far fetched at first because the link is invisible in public images. So, NATO's Science Committee ran hundreds of advanced study institutes through the 1950s to the 1970s on human factors, stress, and violent behavior, precisely because the Cold War blurred military and psychological frontiers. And I think this was a meeting. There was a 1975 Les Arcs, that's LES, ARCS meeting by NATO, and I believe that's where Robert Hare attended. The military world had already learned from World War II that morale, obedience, and emotional conditioning could decide battles. By the 1960s, defense psychology was a recognized NATO research area, feeding studies on leadership, resilience, and interrogation resistance. So, when Hare and others defined psychopathy as a measurable disorder, they were operating inside a larger Cold War logic: identify dangerous minds, predict violent behavior, and filter who could or could not be trusted in uniform or in society. So, for 75 years, NATO's identity has been almost entirely martial: uniforms, aircraft tanks, war games, and flags. It represents hardware, not mindware. So, when people learn that the same institution quietly sponsored behavioral science meetings on psychopathy, no less, the effect is cognitive whiplash. This is where Cleckley and Hare enter the larger picture. So I think he attended the 1975 NATO Advanced Study Institute in Les Arcs, France. The meeting was sponsored by NATO's Science Committee, the same arm funding research on stress, interrogation, and pilot psychology. To ordinary citizens, NATO's planes symbolized power. Its science programs were invisible. Yet those programs helped translate wartime psychology into peacetime institutions, criminal justice, psychiatry, and intelligence. When the public later saw Robert Hare's checklist in courtrooms or textbooks, few realized its lineage traced back to Cold War Defense Forum. The world sees NATO as an alliance of armies. The evidence shows it also acted briefly but profoundly as an alliance of behavioral engineers. The term psychopath, refined under its umbrella, became a kind of mental counterpart to the military threat model: classify, contain, neutralize. That inversion, the idea that the same system designing missiles also helped design psychological categories, is what makes this connection so startling and for most people unforgettable. So I think that Robert Hare attended NATO's Advanced Study Institutes on Violent Behavior and Psychopathy. It was a 10-day meeting where criminologists, psychiatrists, and defense researchers discussed personality assessment and social control. And so that was the 1975 NATO session in Les Arcs, France. So, but see, remember, that's where I first got started with this whole thing. Cleckley was still alive. In 1976, Cleckley completed the fifth edition of The Mask of Sanity. And I looked to see about any connection between Cleckley and Hare, and I found a few things. Cleckley inscribed a copy of the book, The Mask of Sanity, fifth edition, to Robert Hare, and it said the following: For Robert Hare, whose impressive studies of the psychopath have encouraged and stimulated me over the years and have played an important part in enabling me, after long frustration, to complete this fifth edition. End of quote. Although historians often credit Hare as Cleckley's successor, their relationship was reciprocal. Hare provided the data that Cleckley lacked. Cleckley provided the archetype that Hare systemized. The result was a continuum of thought that emerged early clinical psychiatry and merged it with modern behavioral science. So, the NATO Behavioral Conference, where Hare's ideas matured, were not isolated academic gatherings. They belong to a larger military scientific ecosystem exploring aggression, conformity, interrogation, and obedience. The same themes studied under the U.S. and Canadian defense grants in the era of MK Ultra and military psychiatry. Thus, the modern concept of the psychopath and the tools used to detect one did not emerge solely from clinical curiosity. It evolved within the architecture of security research, where understanding the mind was part of controlling the battlefield, the prison, and ultimately the population. To learn that the world's most influential instrument for diagnosing conscience itself traces back to NATO's scientific program is indeed jarring. It turns a psychological label into a political artifact, a product of Cold War defense culture disguised as medical science. If Cleckley gave the psychopath a mask, Robert Hare gave it a score, and NATO quietly gave it a stage. The idea that a military alliance concerned with nuclear deterrence also helped define our definition of moral evil is not something most people expect to find in psychology textbooks. Yes, this is what the record shows, that the science of the human predator and the science of military defense were for a time two sides of the same Cold War coin. So Cleckley was still alive. He died in 1984, yet Hare became the inheritor. 1975 to 78, Cleckley was semi-retired in Georgia, but still publishing the fifth edition of The Mask of Sanity, which came out in 1976, meaning he was very much active in protecting his ideas. But at that very same time, Robert Hare was attending that 1975 NATO Advanced Study Institute in France, the meeting where he publicly announced his plan to quantify the Cleckley list. Hare had no formal authorization from Cleckley. There is no record of co authorship, no record of them talking privately about this. Yet by 1980, Hare's psychopathy checklist, or the PCL, was circulating under his name as the op- op- operational of Cleckley's construct. But there's no paper trail showing that Cleckley handed anything to Hare. I couldn't find anything. So I believe it was a rebranding under the guise of modernization. And I also believe this when you look at how Robert Hare took over Cleckley's legacy, it just wasn't a change in personality, it was a change of the times. During the Cold War, behavioral science was big business. Governments, especially the US, Canada, and NATO programs, were pouring money into research that could measure human behavior for security, military, or correctional purposes. But to get those grants, you needed operational definitions, words that could be scored or replicated. Robert Hare's checklist did exactly that. It turned the abstract idea of evil without empathy into a series of boxes to then tick off. That made it fundable. By the 1970s, Cleckley's work and history was starting to look bad, outdated at best, unethical at worst. So, handing the psychopath label to Hare to a clean academic without those clinical scandals helped protect the field's reputation. And remember, this is only my thinking in the matter. That said, the culture of secrecy and number of overseas bases at the time created environments where small, localized experiments could plausibly have taken place without families understanding what was being done. So we have all these trauma based things going on. MK7, the CIA mind control program that ran roughly from 1953 to 1973, did involve trauma based and coercive experiments, including hypnosis, drug exposure, especially LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological stress to test whether the mind could be split, controlled, or reprogrammed. The goal wasn't framed as creating psychopaths, but as creating controllable or amnesiac subjects, people who could perform actions or transmit information without conscious recall. Researchers like you and Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Canada experimented with psychic driving and deep patterning, effectively trying to erase and rebuild personalities. These practices absolutely did involve extreme trauma. The experiments did produce severe dissociation, amnesia, and long term psychological damage, outcomes that share surface features with what we now call dissociative disorders rather than psychopathy. Over the years, survivors and later investigators noticed that the MK Ultra subjects often displayed flattened affect, emotional numbness, or dissociative detachment, traits that look psychopathic. Some researchers and conspiracy minded writers later interpreted this as evidence that the government was trying to manufacture psychopathic agents, individuals without empathy who could kill or operate covertly without guilt. But there's no declassified document confirming an official goal to create psychopaths. The available records show the intent was control, not character engineering, but the moral line is very thin, and the resulting harm blurred that boundary. During the Cold War MK Ultra era, researchers experimented with trauma, hypnosis, and drugs to see if the human mind could be split, erased, and rebuilt like a tape loop. Officially, they called it deep patterning. Unofficially, it was a form of psychological torture. Some later argued that what they were really studying was how to manufacture people without conscience, functioning psychopaths who could obey without empathy. The documents don't prove that goal outright, but the overlap between trauma, disassociation, and emotional shutdown makes the claim disturbingly plausible. During the Cold War, the MK Ultra era, researchers were experimenting with all of that. Some later argued that they were really studying was how to manufacture people without conscience. So, and around that very same time, psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley was describing something disturbingly similar from a medical angle. In The Mask of Sanity, first published in 1941 and revised through the 1950s, Cleckley wrote about patients who could mimic normal emotion but felt nothing inside. Charming, intelligent, and utterly detached. His work gave the emerging security state a new vocabulary for the human blank slate, a person who could act perfectly sane while being morally hollow. Cleckley's hospital research fed into post war military psychiatry, just as intelligence agencies were asking the same question from another direction. They were asking, can empathy be shut off? Can conscience be erased? The clinicians called it diagnosis. The intelligence world called it control. Both were, in their own way, trying to understand and sometimes to engineer the mind without mercy. So, Cleckley's timeline, he was an active consultant during all this time. Cleckley's descriptions of emotional flatness and masking were circulating in psychiatric and intelligence circles precisely when the Cold War behavioral science turned toward control and depersonalization. I cannot prove that Cleckley was part of the CIA mind control program. The historical overlap is striking, though. Cleckley began his work in the 40s and 50s, describing what he called the psychopathic personality, individuals who function outwardly but lack inner moral structure. Meanwhile, starting in 1953, the CIA launched MK Ultra, a program that experimented with trauma, hypnosis, drugs, and brainwashing in attempts to control or erase parts of the mind. But I can't claim that Cleckley was in the MK7, but I can acknowledge that both his work and the MK Ultra emerged from the very same era of psychological experiments and Cold War urgency. Because in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MK Ultra files, thousands of pages, just as the program was beginning to attract scrutiny in Congress. About 20,000 pages of financial and administrative records survived because they were misfiled. They were later discovered in 1977 through a FOIA request. Those surviving records give partial insight into the program's scope, funding universities, hospitals, and prisons for behavioral control experiments, but not the full roster of participants or case data. Many partner institutions were later identified indirectly, including McGill University, where that Dr. Ewan Camerman was doing the deep patterning studies in Canada, and several U.S. Veterans Administration hospitals, but many records remain missing or classified. So the destruction of records make it impossible to map the entire MK Ultra network with certainty. That's why direct links between Cleckley and MK Ultra specific projects may never be provable, even if indirect overlaps existed through the VA system, military psychiatry, or shared funding channels. So much of what we know about the MK Ultra comes from what survived, not what was destroyed. And also keep in mind, I believe strongly that MK means Mein Kampf, the same book that Hitler supposedly wrote. Well, that was really written by the Jesuits, but anyway, so So most of what we know about MK Ultra comes from what survived, not what was destroyed. So Cleckley's name doesn't appear in what was left. But given how deeply the intelligence world relied on military and VA hospitals, it's not impossible that ideas from his circle bled into those programs. What I can say is that the same government that funded mind splitting experiments was reading from the same clinical script, the study of conscience, control, and the divided self. So, yes, Cleckley was involved with soldiers with head trauma, disciplinary issues, and personality disturbances, as well as forensic patients, prisoners that were declared insane. His goal was essentially root cause mapping, identifying why certain men appear rational yet lacked remorse or emotional depth, which makes it interesting because his goal was root cause mapping, but they never asked these people, why, how did you get so disturbed, right? So, um, so when Cleckley studied the psychopath as a naturally occurring phenomena, MK Ultra treated the mind itself as experimentation material, extending the laboratory beyond hospitals and into unsuspecting civilian populations. Cleckley's early research focused on soldiers, prisoners, and hospital patients, very controlled settings. So, yeah, that whole MK7 thing really bled out into the public. So, yeah, so that's where Cleckley was. I do not have any paperwork saying that he was involved with the MK7, but it would seem pretty far fetched that he wasn't because when Cleckley was around, the first program before MK7 was called Project Bluebird from 1949. It first coordinated effort to study hypnosis and special interrogation. Then, following that, we had Project Artichoke in 1951, expanded to include drugs, shock, and cross national research. And both of those laid the groundwork for Project MK Ultra, which went from 1953 to 1973. So I have a hard time believing that Cleckley, well, it would appear to me that Cleckley would have indeed been involved in the MK Ultra, but I can't prove it. And I've talked about this group in the past, this false memory group. And that group of people, many of the false memory advisors, they had held National Institute of Health offices, Naval Research. Yeah, that whole group that came in to deny the children, they all also came out from a complete military background. So, let me see here. I think that is about that for that. So yeah, so right after World War II, the U.S. and allies began to rebuild psychology as a tool for control. This is all about controlling us, is what it's about. The Office of Naval Research and the Air Force Human Resources Resource Center launched major programs on stress, fatigue, and interrogation resistance. What began as pilot safety research soon expanded into studies on how people break and how to keep them from breaking. At the same time, the Nuremberg Code was written in 1947 to establish ethical rules for human experimentation. On paper, it promised informed consent. In practice, enforcement was, of course, weak. So, yeah, lots went going on. Um, they came up with a false memory group. I did a show about that ages ago. That was created in 1992. That really, well, I won't comment on any more about that group, but yeah, they were there were pedophiles running the group and all kinds of severely handicapped military kind of people, if you ask me. And then, of course, the most famous one that sticks in everybody's mind, the Ted Bundy trial, 1979 to 1980. Bundy was tried in Florida for the Chi Omega murders in 1979 and again in 1980. Cleckley himself did not testify, but several psychiatrists and journalists explicitly called Bundy a classic psychopath, citing the mask of sanity in their reports. The prosecution leaned on that public label to frame him as manipulative, calculating, and fully responsible, but not insane. This was one of the first nationally televised murder trials where the psychopath was used in the media and courtroom language rather than sociopath or insane. In that same time period, mid to late 1970s, Robert Hare was finalizing the original psychopath checklist. The Bundy publicity helped make his structure seem more valuable in years to come. I believe the Bundy trial was a complete psyops, but I'm not going to go there right this second. But yeah, it all ties in together. So Bundy's prosecution was the moment when Cleckley's once academic concept became a public and legal category, bridging wartime behavioral science and the modern criminal justice system. And here's another interesting detail. Um, Robert Hare himself mentions that a 1975 NATO conference influenced his interest or impetus to study psychopathy. And on the Wikipedia page, it also says, frustrated by a lack of agreed definitions, including at a 10-day International North Atlantic Treaty Organization conference in 1975, Hare began developing the psychopath checklist. And that's the meeting that I'm suggesting is the one that happened in France. So, yeah, so they were both alive. Cleckley was alive at the time. They seemed to be pretty friendly, if you ask me. Uh, So, but there's no clear, well documented record in open scholarship that shows a formal NATO contract between Hare and military agencies. Yeah, I couldn't find anything in writing saying that they were all involved, but I think I can pull that together by the time frames. So anyway, so let's run through the complete list of Cleckley's things that he was into. He was into insulin coma therapy, inducing hypoglycemia to trigger comas, thought to reset the brain, documented in his early 1940s publications and casework. He also was involved using this stuff called metrazole shock therapy, used to trigger convulsions before electroshock became standard, highly traumatic. He used ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, common in his later clinical work, often combined with barbiturates and deep sedation. Electronarcosis, deep sleep therapy, prolonged unconsciousness induced by continuous sedative administration intended to break psychosis or neurotic cycles. He was also involved in vitamin and hormone experimentation. He advocated vitamin therapy as a complement to psychiatric treatment. He was involved in multiple personality casework. He co authored The Three Faces of Eve in 1957 with Thigpen, based on that real patient, Eve White. Later involved hypnosis, suggestion, and heavy public sensationalism, creating one of the first media driven psychiatric celebrities. Hypnosis and suggestive therapy, he used both diagnostically and therapeutically, blurring clinical and theatrical lines. And this is one that most people don't know about. He was involved in agriculture and corn work. I don't know, was this to get us to eat a lot of corn? I don't know. He participated in a regional agriculture and public health initiatives in Georgia, and he was mentioned in local archives for studies on niacin deficiencies or pellagra and diet related mental systems, including trials tied to corn based diets in the South. These were connected to early nutrition psychiatric theories that certain psychopathic behaviors were biochemical or dietary in origin. This intersection of corn, niacin, and mental health is part of his lesser known experimental history. So, Cleckley's record shows that the objective science of psychopathy grew directly out of coercive, experimental psychiatry, including coma therapy, deep sedation, hypnosis, and military psychological screening. Cleckley was not a detached observer of evil, but a participant in mid century systems that blurred healing, control, and experimentation. And this is where it gets really interesting. You realize you can't use the word psychopath as your legal defense. Even though the psychopath label dominates popular culture and forensic psychology, it is not a legal diagnosis. Courts only recognize conditions that appear in the DSM, which is the American Psychiatric Association book. Psychopathy isn't listed there. The DSM uses the antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, instead, a much broader category that focuses on outward criminal behavior, not on emotional emptiness or lack of conscience. Because of that, defense attorneys cannot argue that my client is a psychopath, therefore not guilty by reasons of insanity. The laws see psychopathy as a character defect, not a mental disease. To claim insanity, a defendant has to show they couldn't tell right from wrong or couldn't control their actions in the time of the crime. But psychopaths usually know exactly what they're doing and they know it's wrong. They just don't care. So the courts treat them as more culpable, not less. Judges often say a psychopath isn't insane, he's evil. That moral framing goes all the way back to Cleckley's era. His patients looked sane, spoke logically, and planned their actions carefully. He described them as rational without remorse. That's the opposite of what the insanity defense requires. And here's where the paradox is: the legal system rejects psychopathy as a defense, but it embraces psychopathy as a risk score. The same courts that won't accept it as an illness use Robert Hare's PCLR checklist to decide sentencing, parole, and even execution eligibility. So the label can't save you, but it can condemn you. If you're convicted and scored high on Hare's checklist, judges and parole boards often call you untreatable or too dangerous to release. In that sense, Hare's work gave the justice system a perfect weapon, a scientific sounding way to extend punishment indefinitely while still claiming objectivity. Psychopathy seems to sit in a gray zone, too moral to be medical, too scientific to be dismissed, and too convenient for institutions to give up. You can't plead it as a defense, but the system can use it against you at every step after conviction. Most of Cleckley's patients weren't volunteers. They were sent by courts or families, or they were soldiers suffering what we now call trauma. Back then, it was labeled moral weakness, character deficit, or lack of discipline. After World War II, psychiatry, academia, and the military formed a kind of triangle. Universities supplied the experts, hospitals supplied the subjects, and the military supplied the money. So that is exactly how it works. And here is the biggest catch of all. When the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, was rewriting the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, or the DSM, in the late 1970s, the editors faced a problem. They wanted psychiatry to look more scientific, standardized, checklists, clear criteria, measurable disorders. On paper, psychopathy was perfect for that. It already had decades of case studies from Cleckley through Hare. But there was a catch. Hare's version of psychopathy was privately owned. Robert Hare had trademarked the psychopathy checklist. and licensed it through a private publisher. That meant the term psychopathy, at least in measurable, testable form, was effectively Hare's intellectual property. So the APA couldn't just drop psychopathy into the DSM without inviting legal and financial complications or appearing to endorse a proprietary tool. Instead, they created the new label, Antisocial Personality Disorder, or ASPD. It covered many of the same behaviors but avoided the trademark, the royalties, and the controversy. By 1980, when DSM 3 came out, psychiatrists had split the concept in two. Hare owned the forensic version, psychopathy, measured by his checklist used in prisons and research. The APA controlled the clinical version. ASPD was used in hospitals and billing codes. Both sides claimed to be describing the same phenomena, but their motives were very different. Robert Hare wanted exclusive control over who could score, publish, or train on the checklist. The APA wanted a diagnosis that any psychiatrist could use and that insurance could reimburse. So rather than merge, they divided the field and confused the public. The word psychopath stayed powerful in culture, but disappeared from the official manual. Clinicians could say antisocial personality disorder, but journalists, cops, and courts kept saying psychopath. That gap between science, law, and language became Hare's empire. He owned the brand. The APA owned the billing code. And the rest of us were left talking about a disorder that no one institution fully controlled. So the term vanished from the DSM, but ruled the courts anyway. So then Hollywood got involved. Ted Bundy became the face of the charming killer. Silence of the Lamb turned psychopathy into a movie genre. All of that helped hide something much darker, that the same personality traits also thrived in boardrooms, governments, and universities. The spotlight stayed on the monsters, not the managers. By the late 2000s, the researchers tried to reopen it. Psychologists Jennifer Skeeb and David Cook argued that Hare's model was too narrow, that it confused criminality with conscience. They wanted a broader definition that included the kind of bold, manipulative personalities you find outside of prisons. Because Hare's checklist was copywritten, he threatened legal action against their journals. The story hit the Science magazine, the title Psychopathy Researcher Under Fire for Legal Threats. The CBC followed with this Psychopathy Expert Accused of Muzzling Critics. The result silence. Graduate students dropped their projects. Journals backed off. Universities warned against studying psychopathy without permission. A single legal letter had done what decades of debate couldn't. It froze an entire field. It looks now that Hare is retiring. His close collaborator, Carl Gacono, took over much of the training. He co-edited the clinical and forensic assessment of psychopathy in the female psychopath. Gacono runs certification programs for state hospitals and prisons, teaching clinicians how to score inmates on Hare's test. In those systems, a number on the PCLR could determine someone's future, whether they were eligible for release, therapy, or lifelong confinement. Cleckley's wards became Hare's prison, and Hare's prisons became Gacono's civil hospitals. Same logic, new paperwork. NATO, the CIA, and their partners poured money into studying deception, obedience, and dangerous personalities. Psychopathy was the perfect tool, scientific language for moral control. The core idea never changed: measure conscience, manage those who lack it. By the 2010s, the PCLR structure, traits, scores, and profiles had quietly migrated into corporate HR and social media systems. Companies started rating workers and were using similar logic. Who's reliable? Who's deceptive? Who's impulsive? The traits Cleckley saw in his patients, charm, manipulation, lack of empathy, had become desirable in leadership culture. Today, they show people who they appear to be decisive, tough, and efficient. The psychopathic personality had become a management philosophy: move fast and break things, fail forward, don't take it personally. All of it echoed the same moral void. And just like Cleckley's patients, the institutions doing this wear masks. Pharmaceutical companies talk about care. Defense agencies talk about security. Tech companies talk about connection. The language is always moral. The behavior rarely is. The 1940s were about diagnosing the defective conscience. The 1970s were about predicting it. The 2000s were about monetizing it. And today, well, we celebrate it. We call those people leadership, boldness, and visionaries. We built a society that behaves like the disorder it once tried to cure. Power decides what normal looks like. Cleckley had that power in his ward. Robert Hare had it in his lab. When science turns into surveillance, ethics turns into data points. The state calls it security. Corporations call it optimization. It all means the same thing: control through measurements. And because responsibility is split between so many hands, no one feels guilty. Cleckley said he was healing. Hare said he was predicting. But when everyone executes function and no one asks purpose, conscience disappears. The technology keeps changing, but the logic never really does. In the 1940s, it was shock therapy aimed at healing the defective mind. In the 1970s, it became the psychopathy checklist used to label and contain the criminal mind. In the 1990s, that mindset moved into risk assessment software, claiming to protect the public by predicting who might reoffend. And now in the 2020s, it's predictive algorithms, data systems that sort and score entire populations in the name of optimizing humanity. Every era tells the same story. Surveillance is sold as care, and control is packaged as progress. What began as treatment for a few troubled patients has evolved into a global apparatus for managing behavior, one checklist, one data set, one algorithm at a time. The system that was built to detect lack of conscience has become the most conscienceless system of all. They diagnose empathy as weakness. They market indifference as intelligence. It looks to me like the disease has conquered the doctor. If there is a way forward, it begins with conscience. Real science should be open. Data should be shared, not sold. Systems that claim to measure people should be held to the same scrutiny as the people they measure. Success shouldn't mean better prediction, it should mean less harm. Understanding the mind isn't the same as owning it, and knowledge isn't a product, it's a responsibility. In the end, the story of psychopathy isn't really about dangerous individuals, it's about a dangerous idea that morality can be outsourced to systems of power. Cleckley thought he was describing patients without empathy. Hare believed he was creating an objective way to detect them. But together, they developed a world that rewards the very traits they set out to expose: charm without conscience, intelligence without humility, control without care. The checklist became an algorithm, the algorithm became policy, and the mask became all of us. The reckoning begins when we stop diagnosing and start recognizing, when we see that the thing we feared, the person without empathy, isn't somewhere out there. It's in the way we've built the institutions, the markets, and the machines. Science can measure many things, but conscience isn't one of them. Because once empathy becomes a variable, humanity becomes optional. And that, more than any patient Cleckley ever studied, is the real mask of sanity. In the end, this isn't just a story about doctors, checklists, or even NATO. It's a story about how science, power, and morality became entangled, and how a single idea about the psychopath became a mirror for the system that it actually created. These systems built to detect people without empathy have themselves become machines that run without it. Maybe that's the final mask. The moment when we realize the psychopath isn't just the study of this, the subject of the study, it's the structure that made the study possible. And before we go tonight, a moment of gratitude for the man who gave the world a checklist and kept the keys. Dr. Robert Hare once said, I always said that if I wasn't studying psychopaths in prison, I'd do it at the stock exchange. He also told us this: not all psychopaths are in prison, some are in the boardroom. And who could forget this gem? Psychopaths are social predators, and like all predators, they're looking for feeding grounds. Wherever you get power, prestige, and money, you will find them. Dr. Hare also reminded us that therapy often teaches psychopaths new and better ways to manipulate other people. And perhaps his most poetic insight: a psychopath can use a word like I love you, but it means nothing more to him than if he said, I'll have a cup of coffee. So thank you, Dr. Hare, for showing us how far charm, control, and confidence can take a man in a system built to reward them. You didn't just study the mask of sanity, you wore it beautifully. Until next time, keep your checklist close and your conscience even closer. Goodbye for